There is a place on the western edge of France where the land meets the Atlantic in a long, slow argument, where the tides have been pulling at the stone for longer than anyone has thought to count. The city of Brest sits at the tip of a peninsula, exposed to the open ocean, battered by wind and rain for most of the year, and yet somehow permanent, rooted, as though it decided long ago that it would not be moved, no matter what the sea threw at it. During the Second World War, something else was built there that shared that same stubborn quality, something that was meant to last, something that, in a very real sense, did last, even when everything around it had been reduced to rubble and silence. Welcome, if you are here to settle in for the evening, to let the weight of the day lift from your shoulders and drift somewhere far away, then you have found the right place. Tonight we are going underground. We are going to the edge of occupied France, to the grey waters of the Atlantic coast, and we are going to tell the full story of one of the most extraordinary structures ever built during the Second World War, the U-boat pens at Brest. Concrete fortresses sunk into the harbour of a conquered city, built by tens of thousands of hands, bombed relentlessly by Allied aircraft, defended street by street in some of the most brutal urban fighting of the entire Western campaign, and yet, when it was all over, still standing. That is the central puzzle of this story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. The men who designed the pens were not dreamers. They were engineers with a specific problem to solve. How do you protect the most valuable weapons in the German naval arsenal, the submarines of the Kriegsmarine, from an enemy that controls the skies above your coastline? The answer they arrived at was blunt, industrial, and almost medieval in its logic. You build walls so thick that nothing can break them. You pour concrete in quantities that seem almost impossible. You build not just a shelter, but a fortress, and you sink it into the edge of a harbour so that the sea itself becomes part of your defence. And for a time, it worked. What followed was one of the longest and most complicated sieges of the entire war. Not a siege with battering rams and boiling oil, but with 4-engine bombers, radar systems, torpedo-armed aircraft, and eventually Sherman tanks rolling through the narrow streets of a French city, while snipers fired from apartment windows. The pens survived all of it. They outlasted the submarines they were built to protect. They outlasted the men who built them. They outlasted, in a very real sense, the entire war that brought them into being, and they are still there today. That endurance is what makes Brest unusual. Most of the great physical monuments to German military ambition from that period, the Atlantic Wall, the fortifications at Calais, the beach defences of Normandy, exist now as fragments, partial ruins, archaeology. The pens at Brest are something else. They are intact enough to walk through, to stand inside, to look up at a ceiling of reinforced concrete several meters thick and understand, in your body, rather than just your mind, what it meant to try to destroy this place from the air. We are going to take you through every chapter of that story tonight. From the moment German planners first surveyed the harbour at Brest in 1940 and recognized what they had, a deep-water Atlantic port, closer to the convoy routes than almost any other facility they controlled, all the way through to the post-war reckoning, when French and Allied authorities stood inside a captured fortress and asked a question that had no clean answer. What do you do with something like this? Along the way, we will meet the submariners who called Brest their home port, men who spent weeks beneath the Atlantic, hunting convoys in some of the most dangerous conditions any sailor has ever faced, and who returned to the pens knowing that the thick roof above them was the only thing standing between their exhausted bodies and the next RAF raid. We will follow the bomber crews who flew mission after mission against those same roofs, watching their ordnance disappear into smoke and dust, and return on reconnaissance photographs to reveal almost nothing. Walls intact, pens undamaged. Another mission logged, another crew lost, and the target still standing. We will trace the slow turn of the Battle of the Atlantic, that vast, invisible war fought across millions of square kilometers of open ocean, and watch as the strategic tide shifted against the Kriegsmarine in ways that no amount of concrete could reverse. We will see how a facility built to project German naval power eventually became something closer to a trap, a resource-intensive fortress that consumed men and material long after the submarines it sheltered had ceased to be a decisive force. And we will stand at the end of it all in the rubble of September 1944, when American and Free French soldiers finally walked into the pens and found them largely whole, a monument to engineering discipline in the service of a losing cause. This is a story about power and its limits, about the gap between what you can build and what you can ultimately defend, about the way that military history so often turns on the difference between tactical ingenuity and strategic reality, between solving the immediate problem brilliantly while the larger war shifts beneath your feet. It is also, quietly, a story about the people caught inside all of this. The French workers conscripted or coerced into building a fortress for an occupying army. The German sailors who found in the pens something close to safety in a war that offered very little of it. The civilians of Brest who watched their city absorb years of Allied bombing aimed at a target that stubbornly refused to be destroyed. History at this scale is always, underneath the statistics and the strategy, a human story. We will try to honor that throughout the night ahead. So if you are comfortable, if the room is quiet and the light is low, then stay with us. This is the kind of history that rewards patience. It unfolds slowly, the way all the best stories do, layer by layer, pore by pore, the way concrete itself is built. We are going to spend the next several hours at Brest, on the water, underground, in the cockpits of bombers and the cramped pressure hulls of submarines, in the streets of a city fighting for its own survival, and finally, in the long, complicated silence that follows any war, when the guns stop and the questions begin. If this is your first time finding this channel, we would love for you to stay. Hit subscribe, settle into wherever you have made yourself comfortable tonight, and let us take you somewhere the history books rarely linger long enough to truly explore. The fortress is waiting. The concrete is cold and permanent and full of stories. Let us begin. There is a particular quality to silence that settles over a conquered city. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of absence, the sound of everything that used to be, pressing against everything that now is. In the summer of 1940, that silence fell over Brest, like a shroud drawn across a familiar face. The fishing boats still rocked in their moorings. The salt air still carried its ancient smell of tide and rope and iron. But the men who walked the quayside now wore a different uniform, and they looked at the harbour not with the eyes of fishermen or merchants, but with the cool, calculating gaze of strategists who understood with absolute precision what they were looking at. France had fallen with a speed that stunned the world. In 6 weeks, a military machine that many had considered among the most formidable in Europe had buckled and broken under the weight of German armoured thrust. The armistice was signed in late June of 1940, and in its wake, the German military took possession of something it had never held in the previous war, the Atlantic coastline of France. From the Breton Peninsula in the north down to the Spanish border in the south. Germany now controlled a stretch of coast that fundamentally rewrote the geography of naval war. For the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, this was not merely a territorial gain. It was a transformation of operational possibility so profound that its implications would take months to fully absorb. At the far western tip of Brittany, jutting out into the sea like a fist raised against the horizon, sat Brest. The French Navy had understood this harbour's value for centuries. It was one of the finest natural deep-water anchorages in Western Europe, capable of sheltering the largest vessels afloat. It was close, in naval terms, notably close, to the great Atlantic shipping lanes that connected Britain to her empire, to America, to the resources without which she could not survive. For a fleet whose entire strategic purpose was the interdiction of those lanes, Brest was not merely useful, it was transformative. A U-boat departing from Brest could reach its patrol area in a fraction of the time it would take departing from a German North Sea port, saving days of transit, preserving fuel, and extending the hours a submarine could actually spend hunting. The Kriegsmarine's leadership grasped this immediately. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect and driving force of Germany's submarine campaign, had spent years arguing that U-boats represented Germany's most powerful weapon against British sea power. He had calculated in careful detail the tonnage of shipping Britain needed to survive, and the tonnage his submarines needed to sink to bring her to her knees. Those calculations depended on time on patrol, time in the hunting grounds, time spent not transiting thousands of kilometers of sea between base and target. Brest compressed those numbers dramatically in Germany's favor. It was, in Dönitz's strategic vision, the lever that could move the Atlantic War. German naval officers arrived in Brest within days of the French capitulation and walked the harbor with a thoroughness that left nothing uninspected. They examined the existing French naval infrastructure, the dry docks, the repair yards, the fuel storage installations, the administrative buildings. They measured depths and assessed currents. They studied the harbor entrance and the approaches from the open sea. They looked at everything the French Navy had built over generations and asked a single, relentless question: how do we make this serve the U-boat war? The answer, when it came, was both pragmatic and breathtaking in its ambition. They would not simply use what existed, they would build something that had never existed before. The concept that took shape in the planning rooms of the Kriegsmarine and the offices of Organisation Tortu, the vast German construction apparatus responsible for military engineering works, was a submarine shelter on a scale that had no precedent. The fundamental problem was vulnerability. A U-boat sitting at a conventional quayside was a sitting target for aerial bombardment. RAF Bomber Command had already demonstrated its willingness to strike German naval installations, and American air power was on the horizon. A submarine tied to an open pier could be destroyed by a single well-placed bomb. The solution was concrete. Enormous, almost incomprehensible quantities of concrete, poured into forms that would create not a shelter, but a fortress. Bunkers with roofs so thick that no bomb in the current Allied arsenal could hope to penetrate them. Walls that would laugh at blast and shrapnel alike. A structure that would make the submarines inside it essentially invulnerable to air attack. The engineers who surveyed Brest in the months following the French defeat worked with a precision that matched the scale of their ambition. They measured the available ground along the harbor's southern edge, calculating how many submarine berths could be created within the proposed structure's footprint. They assessed the load-bearing capacity of the harbor floor and the logistical requirements for constructing something that would ultimately contain more poured concrete than most nations built in a year. They considered the tidal range, the drainage requirements, the need to maintain operational access to the harbor while construction proceeded. Every variable was catalogued, measured, and fed into plans that grew more detailed and more demanding with each passing week. What emerged from this survey was an engineering vision of extraordinary complexity. The proposed installation would not be a simple shed or a reinforced building. It would be a self-contained fortress within the harbor, housing multiple submarine berths arranged so that boats could be brought in from the sea, serviced, rearmed, refueled, and sent back out again without ever being exposed to open sky. The roofs would be several meters thick, reinforced with steel rods embedded in concrete that would be poured in layers, each layer allowed to cure before the next was added, building up a mass so dense and so deep that even the heaviest bomb would expend its energy in the upper layers before it could penetrate to the submarines sheltering below. The walls would be similarly massive. The entire structure would sit at the water's edge, part harbor installation and part medieval fortification, combining the most ancient instinct of warfare, the stone wall, with the most modern requirements of submarine logistics. The decision to proceed was made with the confidence of a power that believed it had time on its side. In the summer and autumn of 1940, the Luftwaffe was still contesting British skies, and the possibility of a German victory over Britain had not yet faded entirely from German strategic planning. The U-boat campaign was already underway, and the early months of what submariners would later call the happy time, that period when unescorted convoys sailed into waiting wolf packs with devastating results, were demonstrating the potential of what Dönitz had always promised. Building a permanent, fortified base at Brest was not an act of desperation. It was the infrastructure of anticipated victory, the physical expression of a naval strategy that believed it could win the Atlantic War if given the tools and the time. Organization TOT began mobilizing the labor and materials for what would become one of the largest single construction projects in occupied Europe. The logistics alone were staggering. Cement would need to arrive in quantities that strained the capacity of the rail network serving Brittany. Steel reinforcing rods would need to be manufactured, transported, and cut to specification. Aggregate, the sand and gravel that gives concrete its bulk, would need to be sourced locally or brought in, representing millions of tons of raw material. Formwork, the timber molds into which wet concrete would be poured, would require its own supply chain of lumber and skilled carpenters, and all of this would need to proceed continuously, in all weathers, under the pressure of a military timetable that demanded operational pens as quickly as possible. The workforce that would be gathered to accomplish this task was vast, drawn from across occupied Europe through a combination of contracted labor, coerced service, and outright forced labor, a human engine of construction whose conditions and composition would represent one of the darker chapters of the installation's history. Thousands of workers would eventually find themselves in Brest, laboring in the noise and dust of a construction site that never slept. The harbor that had once been France's Atlantic gateway was being remade, literally from the ground up, into something Germany intended to use as the foundation of its mastery over the ocean. What those German engineers could not survey, what their instruments could not measure, and their calculations could not capture, was the future. They could pour the concrete and plan the berths and calculate the roof thickness required to defeat the bombs that existed in 1940. They could not know what technologies would be developed, what alliances would form, what shifts in the tides of war would ultimately determine whether the fortress they were building would ever fulfill the purpose for which it was designed. They stood at the harbor's edge in the autumn of 1940, watching the Breton Sea roll in from the west, and saw in it only opportunity. The concrete they were about to pour would outlast the war, outlast the Reich, outlast the strategic logic that justified every ton of it. But in those first surveying months, with the occupation fresh and German power seemingly unassailable, the men planning the submarine pens at Brest believed with complete conviction that they were building the foundation of a new Atlantic order. The sea stretched out before them, indifferent as always, the drawing boards filled with numbers and angles and load calculations, and the most ambitious submarine fortress in European history began its journey from concept to concrete reality. The winter of 1941 brought cold Atlantic winds rolling in off the sea and across the harbour at Brest. The French port, once a place of commerce and modest military routine, had been remade, almost overnight, into something harder, louder, and altogether more purposeful. German engineers moved through the quayside with surveying equipment and rolled out drawings, measuring sight lines and tidal depths, marking positions with stakes driven into soil that had been French a matter of months before. Orders from the Kriegsmarine High Command had been precise. Build something that could not be destroyed. Build it fast. Build it deep. And build it strong enough to laugh at any bomb an enemy could carry across the channel. The men who received those orders understood the ambition behind them. They also understood the scale of what they were being asked to create. The organization that drove the construction was a machine already familiar with the impossible. The organization TOT had built roads through mountains and bridges across rivers that cartographers had once marked as impassable. It had moved earth and stone across occupied Europe with a systematic efficiency that blurred the line between engineering and industrial warfare. Now, it turned its full weight toward the waterfront at Brest, and within weeks, the harbour began to change in ways that would prove permanent. Surveyors gave way to foremen. Foremen gave way to labour gangs, and from the first weeks of 1941, the ground at the edge of the harbour began to be broken open, shaped, and filled with something far more permanent than ambition. The workforce that assembled at Brest was enormous by any measure. More than 10,000 workers laboured on the construction at its peak, drawn from across occupied Europe under compulsion, contract, or coercion, depending on the circumstances of each individual. French labourers worked alongside conscripted workers from further east. Skilled German construction engineers oversaw the operation, but the raw labour, the mixing, the pouring, the levelling, the reinforcing, was the work of tens of thousands of hands that received no share of the glory their effort would eventually produce. They worked in shifts through day and night, because the Kriegsmarine's schedule brooked no pause for darkness or weather. Arc lights blazed above the quayside in the early months, illuminating a construction site so large and so perpetually active that the harbour's old geography became almost unrecognizable within a single season. The engineering challenge was not simply one of scale. Building a structure large enough to shelter submarines was a problem of volume and height, but building one capable of surviving aerial bombardment was a problem of a fundamentally different kind. German structural engineers had studied the question carefully, and their answer was concrete. Not ordinary concrete poured in ordinary quantities, but reinforced concrete of a depth and density that transformed the material from a building element into a defensive weapon in its own right. The calculations they worked from took account of bomb weights, impact velocities, and penetration depths, and the margins they built in were generous. The roofs of the pens rose to thicknesses of several meters, blunt and undecorated, designed with no aesthetic consideration whatsoever beyond the single imperative of resistance. Walls along the seaward faces were built to comparable specifications. The structure was not intended to be beautiful. It was intended to be unkillable. Steel arrived at Brest in quantities that strained the logistics of the occupation. Reinforcing rods were embedded throughout the concrete mass in dense grids, binding the poured material into a composite that could absorb and distribute the energy of an explosion rather than simply receiving it. Aggregate was sourced from multiple quarries. Aggregate sizes and mix ratios calibrated to produce maximum compressive strength. The concrete itself was mixed continuously in batches, poured in stages that allowed each section to cure before the next was laid above it. This was not construction by improvisation. It was a disciplined industrial process, executed under time pressure, and the engineers who managed it understood that every shortcut risked a structural failure that no amount of later remediation could correct. They drove their teams hard, but they did not allow standards to slip. The pens themselves were designed as individual covered slips, each large enough to accommodate a submarine at dock, while repairs and resupply were carried out under complete overhead protection. The layout organized these slips side by side, under a common roof, separated by thick concrete walls that divided the interior into distinct bays. This arrangement was not accidental. By compartmentalizing the structure, engineers ensured that damage to one bay would not necessarily compromise the rest. A bomb that somehow penetrated the roof in one location would find itself isolated within that single compartment, its destructive energy contained rather than propagated. It was a philosophy of resilience rather than invulnerability, an acknowledgement that no structure could be made entirely immune to attack, but that intelligent design could limit the consequences of any individual breach. Access to the pens from the water was managed through large open gates facing the harbour, wide enough to allow submarines to enter and exit with their conning towers raised. These openings were the structure's only deliberate concession to vulnerability, and German engineers understood them as such. What could not be armoured could at least be organised. The approach angles were calculated, the harbour approaches surveyed, and supplementary defensive positions were considered from the earliest stages of planning. Inside, the bays were equipped with maintenance facilities, workshops, fuel and torpedo storage, and the various systems that allowed a submarine to be returned to fighting condition between patrols. The pens were not merely garages. They were complete industrial facilities, sheltered under concrete, capable of sustaining the operational tempo the Kriegsmarine demanded of its Atlantic fleet. As the months of 1941 progressed, the structure rose with a speed that surprised even those directing its construction. The rhythm of the work became self-reinforcing. Concrete trucks moved in continuous processions. Cranes lifted reinforcing steel into position. Foremen tracked progress against schedules posted on boards at the site perimeter. And the schedules, notably by the standards of any comparable project, were largely met. The organization TOT had developed a production methodology that allowed it to maintain momentum even when individual components of the supply chain faltered. When aggregate deliveries ran short, stockpiles accumulated during better weeks absorbed the deficit. When labor shifts were disrupted by weather, additional hours were added to compensate. The machine compensated for its own interruptions, and the pens climbed steadily toward their designed height. The local population of Brest watched this transformation with a mixture of feelings that no single word adequately describes. The harbour they had known, the trading quays, the naval yards, the modest rhythms of a Breton port city, was being overlaid by a structure so massive and so alien in its purpose that it constituted an occupation of the landscape as much as of the politics. The pens rose above the waterfront like a geological event, grey and featureless and absolute. Whatever the French residents felt about the men who were building it, the structure itself was impossible to ignore or to minimize. It was the most unambiguous physical statement the occupation had yet made. This harbor, these waters, this coast, they now served a different master and a different purpose. By the late months of 1941, the first sections of the pens were sufficiently complete to receive their intended occupants. The transition from construction site to operational facility happened gradually, rather than in a single ceremonial moment. Tools and equipment that had filled the bays gave way to the outfitting crews, the weapons handlers, the fuel lines and maintenance teams that signified a working naval installation. The concrete, still pale with relative freshness, bore the marks of its own making, the lines of formwork, the shadows of reinforcing rods just visible beneath the surface. It was raw and industrial and entirely without ceremony, but it was also, by every engineering measure applied to it, exactly what it had been designed to be. The men who built the pens at Brest would not be celebrated for what they created. Many of them had no choice in the matter of their participation. Some worked under conditions that bore no resemblance to any fair compact between labor and reward. The structure they raised would serve the Kriegsmarine's ambitions and would later become the site of fierce fighting, prolonged bombing, and eventual surrender, none of which had any bearing on the quality of what was built. The concrete was good, the engineering was sound, the structure would outlast the war, outlast the defeat of the regime that ordered its creation, and outlast the careers of every man who directed its construction. Whether that endurance represented achievement or monument is a question the concrete itself does not answer. It simply stands, as it was designed to stand, absorbing everything, yielding to nothing. What had begun as lines on survey drawings in the months following France's fall had become, within a single year, a physical reality so substantial that it would define the harbor at Brest for generations. The Kriegsmarine had its fortress, the Atlantic coast had its scar, and the submarines that would soon slide into those darkened bays would find, above their hulls, a ceiling of reinforced concrete several meters thick, built by 10,000 hands that history would largely forget, for a purpose that history would not. Before the concrete had fully cured, the submarines began to arrive. The pens at Brest were not finished when the first U-boats slid beneath their massive roofs and settled into their berths. The smell of wet concrete still hung in the damp Atlantic air. Workers with chalk-dusted hands stepped aside as diesel-blackened crews threw lines to shore. The machinery of war overtaking the machinery of construction without ceremony or pause. The decision to bring operational boats into the partially completed facility was deliberate. The Kriegsmarine understood that waiting for perfection would cost weeks, and weeks, in the Battle of the Atlantic, could cost thousands of tons of Allied shipping. The shelter did not need to be finished to be useful. It needed only to be above the waterline and thick enough to matter, and by the time the first boats moved in, it was already both. What Brest offered the Kriegsmarine was something no base in the Reich itself could provide: proximity. From a home port on the German North Sea coast, a U-boat commander heading for the Atlantic shipping lanes faced a long, dangerous, fuel-consuming transit, north around the British Isles, past hostile air patrols, through waters increasingly watched by Allied eyes. The round trip alone could consume a third or more of a patrol's endurance before a single enemy vessel was sighted. Brest changed that arithmetic in a single stroke. Situated on the western tip of the Breton Peninsula, it threw its piers and its concrete berths out toward the open Atlantic, as though the land itself were pointing the way. A submarine departing Brest was already past the defensive perimeter that geography had granted Britain. it was already hunting. The reduction in transit time was not merely a matter of comfort or convenience. It was a fundamental shift in operational reach. A boat that previously spent days simply getting to its patrol area could now reach the convoy routes in a fraction of the time, patrol longer, and return without the harrowing northern passage. Crew endurance, which was always a limiting factor in submarine warfare, could be redirected from mere survival during transit to active operations. Torpedo loads that might once have been expended defensively during the run out and back could now be saved entirely for the hunt. Senior Kriegsmarine planners understood this with the clarity of men who had been fighting the tonnage war and watching their margins narrow. Brest was not just a harbour, it was a mathematical advantage. The Wolfpack doctrine, already developed and practiced in the early years of the Atlantic campaign, found in Brest a natural home. The concept relied on coordination, multiple boats vectored onto a convoy by a directing headquarters, overwhelming escort screens through simultaneous attack from different angles. Timing and position were everything, and a base that shortened the approach gave commanders more flexibility in deploying their boats. A pack could be assembled and dispatched more quickly. Boats could be recalled for maintenance and returned to station faster. The rhythm of the campaign accelerated from Brest's concrete cradles, each departure a tightening of the grip on Allied supply lines. The port buzzed with that rhythm, the loading of torpedoes, the provisioning of stores, the careful checking of hydrophone arrays and diving trim, all of it compressed and sharpened by the efficiency the new base made possible. The men who crewed those boats were, in 1942, among the most experienced submariners in any navy on Earth. Many had been at sea since the earliest days of the Atlantic campaign, learning the hard lessons of convoy escort tactics and Allied countermeasures through direct encounter. They came into Brest carrying that experience in their hands and behind their eyes. In the practiced way they moved through narrow pressure hulls, in the way they spoke to each other with an economy of words that came from shared danger. A successful patrol ended at the pier, with a pennant flying from the conning tower, one pennant for each vessel sunk, and for a time, in 1942, those pennants multiplied. The crews walked down gangplanks into a port that received them not merely as sailors returning, but as men who had reached directly into the Atlantic War and pulled something back. Brest itself was reshaping around them. The port that had once served French fishing fleets and naval vessels was now something altogether different. A German military installation of the First Order, its character transformed by occupation and purpose. French civilians still moved through the town's streets, but the streets themselves had changed their nature. German military administration had reordered commerce, movement, and daily life to serve the needs of the submarine fleet. Supply depots expanded, fuel storage grew. The rail lines that fed the port were given over largely to military freight. The harbour that had known the rhythms of tide and trade now ran on the rhythms of patrol schedules and maintenance rotations, and the Kriegsmarine's administrative machinery imposed itself on everything with the thoroughness of an organization that understood logistics as a form of warfare. The partially completed pens drew attention from every direction. Kriegsmarine officers made inspection visits, filing reports that measured the progress of construction against operational need. Engineers noted what remained to be done, even as submarines occupied the berths already open. Supply officers calculated the quantities of fuel, lubricant, food, and ordnance needed to sustain an expanding operational base. Medical staff established facilities to treat returning crews, men worn thin by weeks of confinement in steel tubes, some of them carrying the physical marks of depth charges and engine failure, and the particular exhaustion that came from hunting through the North Atlantic in winter. The pens, even incomplete, were already becoming a small city with a single purpose. The Allied shipping losses in that period were severe enough to produce genuine alarm in London and Washington. The tonnage figures climbing through official reports were not abstract numbers. They represented food, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and men lost to the Atlantic, each loss a subtraction from the total capacity with which the Allies could wage the wider war. Brest sat at the center of that campaign, not as a distant abstraction, but as a specific, mappable, terrifyingly productive base from which the losses flowed. British naval intelligence tracked departures and returns as best it could, piecing together the picture from signals intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and the painful reports of convoy survivors. What emerged was a portrait of an installation that was performing exactly as its designers had intended, sustaining a submarine fleet at the peak of its destructive reach. That destructive reach had a geography, and Brest was its fulcrum. The mid-Atlantic gap, that broad stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based air cover from either direction, was where the wolf packs did their most devastating work. Convoys that entered the gap lost the aerial protection that had become increasingly important as a deterrent to surfaced U-boat attacks. Boats operating from Brest could reach the edges of that gap and wait, sometimes in loose coordination, sometimes in the tighter coordination of a directed pack. The convoys moved on fixed schedules, shaped by port capacity, loading times, and escort availability, and the submarines, patient, learned those schedules in the way predators learn the movement patterns of their territory. Brest gave them the range to be patient, and the logistics to remain dangerous. The port's defenses grew in proportion to its importance. Anti-aircraft batteries were positioned across the harbour approaches and along the hills above the town. German fighter cover was arranged to respond to Allied intrusion. The submarine pens themselves, still growing thicker with each additional concrete pour, became the armoured heart around which a broader defensive system organized itself. For the Kriegsmarine, protecting Brest meant protecting the mechanism that multiplied the effectiveness of every boat in the Atlantic fleet. The resources invested in defense were justified by the operational returns, or so the calculation ran in 1942, when those returns were still impressive enough to make the numbers appear to balance. The transformation of Brest was complete enough by the middle of that year that it was no longer accurate to describe the city as merely occupied. It had been remade, the port's identity, its commercial purpose, its French naval tradition, its place in the ordinary economy of Brittany, had been overlaid by something industrial and martial and relentless. The pens rose from the harbour front like cliffs of man-made stone, indifferent to weather, indifferent to tide, indifferent to the peacetime purposes the harbour had once served. Workers still moved across the construction site in their thousands, pouring and forming and reinforcing, racing a schedule set not by engineering convenience, but by the demands of a war that consumed days faster than concrete could set. And among those unfinished walls, diesel engines turned, periscopes were checked, and men who had spent weeks beneath the surface of the Atlantic prepared to go back. There was no ceremony to mark the moment Brest became operational in the full sense. The war did not pause for dedications or ribbons. It became what it was gradually, and then completely, the way a fortress assembles itself not in a single act of construction, but in the accumulation of purpose. By the latter half of 1942, the pens were receiving boats, turning them around, and sending them back to the Atlantic, on schedules that the Kriegsmarine's high command regarded with satisfaction. The sleepy French port that German engineers had surveyed 2 years earlier, with clipboards and theodolites, had become something they had always intended, and perhaps had not fully imagined. The sharpest edge of German naval power, pressed directly against the throat of the Allied war effort, sheltered beneath hundreds of thousands of tons of reinforced concrete, and pointed west toward open water. The water at Brest ran dark and cold in the early mornings of 1942. Beneath the surface of that harbour, something vast and purposeful had taken root, not in the romantic sense, but in the mechanical, industrial sense of a weapon finding its range. The U-boats that now moved through those waters were not symbols. They were tools, precisely engineered for a single purpose: to sever the arterial flow of men, fuel, and material that kept Britain breathing. From the reinforced concrete of the partially completed pens, crews emerged into grey Atlantic light, checked their gear, received their orders, and slipped beneath the surface of the Bay of Biscay with the quiet efficiency of men who had learned to live inside iron cylinders for weeks at a time. The base at Brest had become more than a shelter. It had become a rhythm, the rhythm of departure and return, of patrol and repair, of depth charges heard through a hull, and the silence that followed. That rhythm would, for a time, beat with devastating regularity against the Allied lifeline crossing the North Atlantic. To understand what the wolf packs were doing in 1942, you have to understand the geometry of the problem they were solving. Britain was an island nation fighting a continental war. Every shell, every barrel of aviation fuel, every ton of grain, every replacement engine for an aircraft factory in the English Midlands, all of it had to cross the Atlantic by ship. The convoys that made that crossing were not simply supply runs. They were the circulatory system of the entire Allied war effort. Cut them, and you did not merely inconvenience the British war machine, you began to strangle it. The German Naval Command understood this with cold clarity, and from Brest, the transit time to the mid-Atlantic hunting grounds was shorter than from any other German-held port. That compression of time and distance meant more hours on station, less fuel burned in transit, and more tonnage sent to the bottom before any boat had to turn for home. The Wolfpack tactic itself was not improvisation. It was doctrine, developed and refined across years of strategic thinking, built around a simple but brutal principle. Enough submarines attacking at once could overwhelm the defensive screen around any convoy. A single escort vessel could not be in two places simultaneously. It could not pursue a submarine on the port side, while another closed from the starboard beam in the dark. The packs operated on coordinated signals, spreading across broad ocean corridors, waiting for one boat to find a convoy, then broadcasting its position so that others could converge. The attack would come at night, surfaced, at close range, in conditions that degraded the escort's ability to respond. It was organized predation, and in the early months of 1942, it worked with a frequency that alarmed Allied planners to their core. For the crews themselves, life inside a U-boat on Atlantic patrol was defined by contrasts so extreme they bordered on the surreal. The interior of a working submarine on patrol was cramped beyond easy description. A steel tube, roughly the length of a modest city street, packed with machinery, torpedoes, provisions, and men. The smell alone was something veterans described for the rest of their lives. Diesel oil, salt water, unwashed bodies, the particular chemical signature of machinery running hot in an enclosed space. Sleep happened in rotation, in bunks wedged between torpedo racks and bulkheads. Meals were whatever the cook could manage in a space barely large enough to turn around in. The tension of a depth charge attack, the weight, the concussion, the groaning of the hull, was followed, sometimes hours later, by silence so complete it had its own weight. Then, eventually, there was Brest. The return, the pens, the particular relief of stepping onto concrete after weeks beneath the sea. Brest rewarded that endurance, with something approaching comfort, at least by wartime naval standards. The base had developed quickly into a functioning support ecosystem. Not just the pens themselves, but the repair workshops, the torpedo stores, the engineering teams who could replace a damaged propeller shaft or patch a compromised pressure hull between patrols, the officers' quarters, the dockside facilities, the administrative machinery of a major operational base. All of it had been assembled with German thoroughness. For a crewman returning from weeks in the Atlantic, the pens meant electric light, a proper meal, a bunk that did not vibrate to the sound of engines. It meant that the next patrol would begin from a boat that had been properly serviced, rather than one limping on makeshift repairs. That logistical competence was not incidental to the Wolfpack's effectiveness. It was foundational to it. The results in 1942 were severe enough that Allied planners referred to the period in terms usually reserved for catastrophe. The monthly tonnage figures for Allied merchant shipping, lost to submarine attack, climbed through the late winter and into spring, peaked across the summer, and remained at levels that pressed the outer boundary of what Britain's supply chain could absorb. Hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping went down across those months. Tankers, cargo vessels, troop transports, the full range of maritime commerce that the Allied war effort depended upon. The human cost embedded in those tonnage figures was equally grave, though it moved more quietly through official communications. Merchant sailors, many of them civilians by any reasonable definition, went into the Atlantic cold in lifeboats, or not at all. That human dimension was largely invisible to the machinery of strategy, but it was never invisible to the men involved. Among the German submariners, the pens at Brest acquired a reputation that was part practical and part mythological. Practical, because the facility genuinely worked. It extended range, improved maintenance cycles, reduced time in transit, and kept boats operational that might otherwise have been lost to attrition. Mythological, because the base had become associated with the campaign's most celebrated commanders, the men whose patrol results were communicated back to Germany and turned into propaganda currency. Brest was where those men returned, where they were received, decorated, photographed. The concrete pens formed the backdrop against which the Kriegsmarine's narrative of naval dominance was performed for public consumption back home. Whether that narrative was accurate in its full dimensions was another question, one the propaganda apparatus was not interested in entertaining. The broader strategic picture was, even at the height of Wolfpack success, more complicated than the tonnage figures alone suggested. The Americans had entered the war at the end of 1941, and while their initial anti-submarine measures along the eastern seaboard were dangerously inadequate, producing a period of losses sometimes called by those who documented it a second happy time for German submariners, the industrial weight of American shipbuilding was already beginning to express itself. The United States built ships faster than the Wolfpack sank them, at least across the medium term. This was not yet visible in the tactical results of early 1942, but it was present in the underlying arithmetic in a way that would eventually become impossible to ignore. At Brest, none of this arithmetic penetrated the daily rhythm of operations. Boats departed, boats returned, tonnage was reported, and the pens filled and emptied on the tidal schedule of the Atlantic War. The Allied response was also evolving, quietly and systematically, in ways that would not fully reveal themselves until 1943. Convoy routing was being refined. The use of aerial coverage over the Atlantic was expanding as longer-range aircraft became available. Escort groups were growing in size, and crucially, in tactical sophistication, learning from each engagement, developing countermeasures, sharing intelligence across national boundaries in ways that the German submarine command found difficult to account for. The code-breaking work that fed into Allied operational decisions was particularly consequential. though its full significance would remain concealed behind layers of secrecy for decades after the war ended. At the level of any given patrol departing Brest, these changes were invisible. The Atlantic still swallowed boats and kept no record. But the balance was shifting, grain by grain, in a direction that would eventually become irreversible. What the men who crewed the U-boats from Brest could not have known, and what the commanders who sent them may have privately suspected, was that the machinery of their own success carried within it the seeds of a different kind of reckoning. Every boat that departed from those concrete pens was also a finite resource. Every crew lost was irreplaceable in the time frame that mattered. The tactical victories of 1942 were real. The tonnage sent to the bottom was real, but so was the mounting cost in experienced personnel, in hull losses, in the accelerating pace at which Allied countermeasures were improving. The wolf packs were running at something close to their operational ceiling. Below that ceiling, the conditions for their eventual reversal were already assembling. There is a particular quality to the silence inside a submarine pen when the boats are away on patrol. The concrete amplifies it. The massive walls, designed to stop bombs and shells, also stop sound, the noise of the outside world, the wind off the Atlantic, the movement of the harbor. In that silence, the maintenance crews worked. The administrative machinery of the base continued its quiet operation, and somewhere on the other side of that concrete, in the open ocean beyond the French coast, the boats hunted. The pens at Brest had become the gravitational center of the Atlantic battle, the place from which the campaign radiated outward and to which it returned. That centrality would draw Allied attention with increasing intensity. But in the months when the wolf packs were at their most dangerous, the pens simply endured, solid and dark, waiting for the sound of returning engines and the particular vibration of a submarine hull settling into its berth after weeks at sea. The legacy of what happened in those months is not simple. The wolf packs operating from Brest came closer to severing the Atlantic supply line than most popular accounts of the war acknowledge. The margin by which that supply line held was not comfortable. It was maintained through improvisation, sacrifice, and a form of institutional learning that Allied naval forces performed at speed, under conditions that punished error with finality. The pens themselves were part of that story, the physical infrastructure that made the campaign possible, the concrete expression of a strategic ambition that, for a period of roughly 18 months, had genuine cause to believe it could succeed. That period would not last. What followed it would be a different kind of story entirely, one of attrition, reversal, and the slow erosion of everything the pens had been built to protect. But in the cold months of 1942, and into the first weeks of 1943, the boats went out from Brest, and the Atlantic ran deep with consequence. From the moment the concrete began to cure at Brest, someone on the other side of the war was watching. British intelligence had not been idle during the long months of German construction. Aerial photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft in the early months of 1941 had already begun to reveal the true scale of what the Kriegsmarine was building along the Breton coastline. Analysts at RAVIEF Medmenham, the Allied Center for Photographic Intelligence, pored over these images with magnifying lenses and practiced eyes, measuring shadows, tracing outlines, calculating volumes of poured concrete. What they saw alarmed them. The structures rising at Brest were not ordinary port facilities or simple repair sheds. They were something categorically new, massive, deliberate, and clearly intended to endure. Long before the pens were operational, the men and women studying those photographs understood that the Allies were looking at a problem without an easy solution. The port of Brest had long held strategic significance. that both sides understood instinctively. Sitting at the very tip of the Brittany Peninsula, it jutted into the Atlantic like a pointing finger aimed at the heart of the British convoy routes. The deep natural harbour could accommodate the largest vessels afloat, and its position cut days from the transit time any submarine would otherwise spend sailing from German home ports around the northern tip of Scotland and down into the open ocean. When the Kriegsmarine chose Brest as its primary Atlantic base for U-boat operations, they were not being romantic about geography. They were being coldly precise about it. Every submarine berthed at Brest instead of Kiel or Wilhelmshaven gained operational range. Every torpedo fired from a wolf pack that had staged through Brest represented a direct multiplication of German striking power. British intelligence officers understood this arithmetic with painful clarity, and the numbers frightened them. By the time American forces entered the war, at the close of 1941, the intelligence picture at Brest had grown considerably more detailed. The United States Army Air Forces brought with them both resources and a particular institutional confidence in the power of strategic bombing. American planners believed, with a conviction that bordered on doctrine, that a sufficiently sustained and accurate bombing campaign could destroy any target of industrial or military significance. The U-boat pens at Brest presented themselves as exactly the kind of high-value, discrete target that seemed suited to this theory. If the pens could be destroyed, or even severely damaged, German submarine operations from the Atlantic's most advantageous port could be disrupted, perhaps catastrophically. Allied shipping losses, which had reached devastating levels through much of 1942, might be driven down. The case for attacking Brest was almost self-evident. The question was not whether to strike it, but whether striking it was possible at all. The first serious joint planning discussions between RAF Bomber Command and USAF staff officers circled around a central tension that would never fully resolve itself. On one side sat the strategic argument. Brest mattered, the pens mattered, and the war at sea was going badly enough that any target promising relief to the convoy routes deserved maximum effort. On the other side sat the structural reality. Reconnaissance photographs and captured German engineering documents, filtered through Allied intelligence channels, had begun to reveal just how thick those concrete roofs truly were. Early estimates suggested the main shelter roofs were several meters of reinforced concrete, poured in layers, with steel rebar woven through them. The largest bombs, then, in Allied inventory, had been designed with industrial targets in mind: factory rooftops, railway marshalling yards, oil storage facilities. None of them had been designed to crack open something that was, for practical purposes, a man-made cliff. The planners found themselves staring at a target that announced its own near invulnerability. RAF officers with direct experience of the Brest area brought another layer of caution to the table. The port was not defended by the concrete of the pens alone. The Germans had understood from early in the occupation that Brest was a prize worth protecting, and they had ringed the port and its approaches with anti-aircraft batteries in numbers that grew steadily as the war progressed. These were not light flak positions designed to harass low-flying aircraft. They were heavy-caliber installations capable of reaching the altitudes at which medium and heavy bombers operated. A raid on Brest would require aircraft to fly through corridors of concentrated anti-aircraft fire before they even reached the target. And once over the target, they would need to achieve precision, or at least concentration, sufficient to actually threaten structures designed by engineers who had specifically anticipated aerial attack. The RAF officers, who had already flown over Brest in 1941 and early 1942, did not need to exaggerate the difficulty to make their point. The numbers spoke for themselves. American planners approached the problem from a different angle, one rooted in the doctrine of high-altitude daylight precision bombing that the USAF had developed through the 1930s and carried into the war as near gospel. The argument was straightforward in theory. If bombers flew high enough to reduce their exposure to flak, and if bombardiers could achieve sufficient accuracy from altitude, then even massively reinforced structures could be systematically degraded. A single direct hit from a heavy bomb would not crack the pens open, but enough hits, concentrated over time, striking the same points on the same roofs, might eventually compromise the structural integrity of the concrete. The pens could be rendered unusable without being physically demolished. It was a theory that sounded persuasive in briefing rooms. It would prove far more complicated in the air over Brittany. What united both services, despite their doctrinal differences, was a recognition that doing nothing was not an acceptable answer. The U-boats operating from Brest were sinking Allied ships in numbers that strained the entire Atlantic supply effort. Every week that passed without a serious attempt on the pens was a week in which the Kriegsmarine operated from its strongest Atlantic position without meaningful disruption. The moral and strategic pressure on Allied air commanders was immense, and it came not just from within the military chain of command. Political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic understood that the U-boat war was the war, that if the shipping lanes were cut or sufficiently bled, everything else the Allies were planning to do in Europe became impossible. Brest, and what lived inside its concrete fortress, sat at the center of that existential pressure. The planning process itself was a study in the collision of optimism and evidence. Intelligence officers continued to refine their assessments of the pen's dimensions and the composition of their construction materials. Bomb damage assessment specialists ran calculations on what weights and types of ordnance would be needed to achieve meaningful penetration. The answers that came back were consistently discouraging. The bombs available in quantity simply could not be expected to break through roofs of the depth being reported from Brest. There were proposals for specialized deep penetration munitions, for attacks from unusual angles, for combinations of incendiary and high explosive loads that might achieve through secondary effects what direct hits could not. Some of these ideas had genuine merit. Others were the product of desperation dressed up in technical language. All of them shared the same basic problem. They were theories, and the pens at Brest were facts. Reconnaissance missions over Brest intensified through the early months of planning. Long-range aircraft equipped with cameras flew out from British airfields to photograph the port, the construction progress, and the defenses surrounding it. These flights were not without danger. German fighter patrols covered the Brittany coast, and an unarmed reconnaissance aircraft at low altitude over a defended port was a fragile thing. The pilots who flew these missions understood what they were doing, and did it with the matter-of-fact courage that had become characteristic of the reconnaissance units. The photographs they brought back were essential. Without current imagery, planners would have been targeting a construction project as it had stood weeks or months earlier. With current imagery, they could at least understand the target as it existed in the present, even if understanding it did not make it easier to destroy. Beyond the physical challenge, the planners were beginning to wrestle with a question that would grow more uncomfortable as operations continued. Brest was a French city. Its streets and neighborhoods surrounded the port installations on three sides. The civilian population that had lived and worked in Brest before the occupation had not ceased to exist simply because German engineers had moved in. Any serious aerial campaign against the pens and the port infrastructure would inevitably place those civilians at risk. Bombing accuracy from altitude, even under favorable conditions, was a statistical matter. Bombs fell in patterns, and those patterns extended beyond intended targets. The Allied planners were not indifferent to this reality. It appeared in their discussions, created friction, and occasionally reshaped specific targeting decisions. But it never stopped the planning. The strategic mathematics of the Atlantic War were brutal, and the men making these decisions understood that inaction carried its own casualty count, measured in sunken ships and drowned merchant sailors. By the time the first serious raid packages were being assembled, the planning process had produced something unusual, a campaign against a target that almost everyone involved believed could not be destroyed by the methods available. The pens at Brest represented a genuine novelty in the history of strategic bombing, a military installation so thoroughly over-engineered for its specific threat that the threat itself was insufficient. Allied air commanders knew this. Their intelligence officers had told them plainly. Their bomb damage specialists had run the numbers and shaken their heads. And yet the campaign would go ahead, because the alternative, leaving the U-boat's most powerful base unmolested while Allied ships burned in the Atlantic, was simply not an option that the war permitted. The bombers would fly, the bombs would fall, and somewhere in the gap between what was planned and what was possible, the cost would be paid by the men in the air. What the Allies were assembling in those planning rooms was not just a bombing campaign. It was the first honest reckoning with the limits of air power against purpose-built defensive architecture. The fortress at Brest had been constructed precisely to survive what was now being planned against it, and on some level, everyone in the room understood that. The pens had been designed with a contemptuous confidence in their own survival, a confidence that the concrete itself seemed to broadcast. Challenging that confidence would require not just bombs, but a sustained, costly, and ultimately uncertain commitment of men and machines against a target that had been built to outlast all of them. The Allied eyes that had turned west to Brest were clear-eyed enough to see what was coming. They went ahead anyway. The bombers came before the concrete was even finished curing. RAF Bomber Command had watched the construction at Brest with mounting alarm through 1941 and into 1942, understanding, even from grainy reconnaissance photographs, that what was rising along that Breton harbour was not simply a maintenance facility or a docking structure. It was a fortress. Every week that passed without action was another week the German engineers bought themselves, another pour of reinforced concrete, stiffening those walls towards something approaching invulnerability. And so the order came down. Attack the pens, attack the port, stop the construction if you can, and if you cannot stop it, slow it. The crews who received those orders climbed into their aircraft with the particular quiet that settles over men who have been asked to do something they already sense may be beyond what their tools can accomplish. They flew anyway. That, in the end, is what the record shows above almost everything else. They flew anyway, again and again, through flak and fighter interceptions and the brutal arithmetic of attrition, pressing their attacks against something that was already beginning to look less like a target and more like a geological feature. The early raids of 1942 tested what conventional bombing could realistically achieve against heavily reinforced concrete. The answer arrived quickly and without ambiguity. Standard high-explosive bombs, even those carried by the heavier aircraft in Bomber Command's inventory at the time, were designed around assumptions rooted in a world of brick and steel and timber, industrial buildings, rail yards, urban infrastructure. Against 2, 3, 4 meters of densely reinforced concrete, they behaved differently. They detonated on the surface or penetrated only the uppermost layer before spending their energy in noise and fire and displaced rubble that left the structural core essentially untouched. Aerial photographs taken after the first significant raids, showed craters in the surrounding earth, scorched concrete faces, shattered approach roads. But the pens themselves stood. The roofs, those cathedral slabs of grey material that the German construction teams had laboured through night shifts to build, absorbed what the bombers threw at them and gave back nothing except the image of their own stubborn mass. Planners in Britain stared at those photographs and began to understand the nature of the problem they had inherited. Brest was not defended only by concrete. The Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe had invested heavily in the anti-aircraft umbrella protecting the installation, and approaching bomber formations encountered walls of flak that climbed in layered bursts from the harbour perimeter and the surrounding hillsides. German gunners operating those batteries were trained, practiced, and increasingly experienced as the raid cycle repeated. They knew the approach corridors, they knew the altitudes the bombers favoured, and they understood that their role was not simply to shoot aircraft down, but to disrupt the bomb run, to force evasive action at the critical moment when a navigator needed stillness and consistency to place ordnance accurately. Even a near miss, in this sense, was a victory for the defenders. A bomber that jinked and climbed and rolled through flak released its bombs with degraded accuracy, and against a target with such limited vulnerable surface area, degraded accuracy meant wasted effort and wasted lives. The flak batteries at Brest made accuracy deeply difficult to achieve, and the geometry of the problem compounded every other difficulty the raid planners faced. Fighter cover added the second dimension of the defensive equation. German interceptors operating from Breton airfields rose to meet incoming raids with increasing efficiency as 1942 progressed, and the escort picture for the British bombers remained complicated. The range requirements and the tactical realities of the period meant that unescorted or lightly escorted formations faced genuine peril from interceptors that could concentrate against the bomber stream with time and fuel to spare. Crews who survived the flak belt then had to manage the fighter threat on the way back out, which compounded the stress of what were already long and demanding missions flown in aircraft that offered limited protection against cannon fire. Losses climbed. Not catastrophically in every individual raid. Some operations were mounted at night under conditions that limited the fighter threat. But cumulatively, across the weeks and months of the campaign, the attrition added up into numbers that Bomber Command's leadership could not ignore, and could not pretend were proportionate to the damage being inflicted on the target. The exchange rate was wrong, and most people with access to the full picture understood that it was wrong. There was a particular cruelty to the night bombing approach that deserves acknowledgement. Flying in darkness reduced exposure to the fighter threat and allowed larger formations to approach with some degree of concealment, but it also stripped away whatever slim margin of precision daylight offered. Against a target like the Brest pens, which occupied a finite footprint within a populated port city, nighttime area bombing meant accepting that bombs would fall across a wide radius, on the harbour, on the surrounding shipyard infrastructure, on streets and houses, and the lives of French civilians who had no part in what was being decided above them. The moral weight of this was not lost on those who planned the operations, or on many of those who flew them. Brest was a French city. Its people were not the enemy, and the structures being bombed to limited effect sat among homes and churches and the ordinary architecture of a working port community. Every raid that failed to crack the pens while producing civilian casualties was a raid that complicated the political and moral arithmetic of the campaign, and those complications accumulated alongside the operational ones. Through the autumn and winter months of 1942 and into the early weeks of 1943, the raids continued on a rhythm that became almost routine in its repetition and almost routine in its failure to achieve the primary objective. Crews returned with bomb damage assessment photographs that showed peripheral destruction, supply roads cratered, auxiliary buildings damaged, the outer skin of the installation marked and blackened, but the main shelter roofs remained intact. German repair teams, working with the same organizational efficiency that had built the pens in the first place, cleared debris and patched surface damage with a speed that impressed even the British intelligence analysts, whose job was to assess the results. What the bombers broke in an evening's work, the Germans frequently repaired within days. The pens were not simply resistant to attack, they were maintained with a tenacity that matched the persistence of the attackers, making the whole campaign feel less like a progressive erosion of the target and more like a cyclical exchange with no decisive terminus in sight. The human cost inside the aircraft was being paid in full, regardless of what the photographs showed. Aircrew losses over Brest and its approaches represented a real and growing burden on Bomber Command's trained personnel, men who had gone through the long cycle of selection, training, and crew integration that the Air Forces required, lost over a target that was absorbing every blow without meaningful structural compromise. Experienced crews were particularly painful losses because experience was not quickly replaced. A crew that had learned together, developed the small cooperative instincts and understandings that kept aircraft functional under pressure, represented an investment that could not simply be reordered from the training pipeline. The loss of such crews over a target that was demonstrably resistant to the weapons being used against it forced hard conversations at multiple levels of command about whether the campaign against the Brest pens was producing anything worth the price being paid to sustain it. The questions that surfaced in those conversations were not comfortable ones, and they pointed toward an awkward truth that some in the planning apparatus had begun articulating in careful, qualified language. The problem at Brest might not be solvable by the tools currently available. This was not defeatism. It was engineering reality. The concrete that covered those pens had been calculated to resist the largest bombs that aircraft of the period could practically carry and deliver, and that calculation appeared to be correct. The bombers could maintain pressure on the surrounding infrastructure, disrupt the flow of supplies and equipment into the port, force the Kriegsmarine to divert resources into damage repair and defensive strengthening. These were real, if indirect, effects, but destroying the pens themselves, collapsing those roofs onto the submarines sheltering beneath them, lay outside what conventional bombing of the era could reliably accomplish. Acknowledging this did not make the campaign pointless, but it did require a recalibration of what the campaign could realistically be expected to achieve. Across the Channel, German commanders at Brest watched the raids with a professional assessment that was part relief and part growing confidence. The pens were absorbing what the RAF could deliver, and the submarines inside them were sheltered. Maintenance continued. Crews rested and prepared for the next patrol. The bombing was an irritant. It disrupted port operations. It required constant anti-aircraft vigilance. It occasionally killed German personnel in the outer defensive perimeter or the support facilities around the harbour, but it was not a threat to the pens themselves in any fundamental sense. If anything, the raids served to confirm the engineering logic behind the entire construction program. Money and concrete and labour invested in shelter had brought a degree of security that the Allies, for all their air power, could not yet overcome. German planners took note. So did their counterparts in occupied Atlantic ports elsewhere along the coast. The Brest model was working, and working visibly. By early 1943, the gap between effort and outcome had grown wide enough that it was forcing substantive debate within Allied air power circles about both strategy and technology. New approaches were being considered: larger bombs, modified delivery methods, different attack profiles, because the existing approaches had been tested against Brest and found insufficient. The cost of that insufficiency was written in the records of lost aircraft and missing aircrews, in the reports that described the same grey roofs standing in photograph after photograph, despite everything that had been dropped against them. The campaign had drawn first blood, German blood surely, but predominantly the blood of the men flying the bombing missions, and had produced no corresponding wound in the concrete. That paradox would sit at the center of Allied planning discussions as the air war over Brest prepared to enter its next, more intensive phase. What the early raids had established, despite their failure to crack the pens, was a certain irreversible momentum. Bombing had begun, which meant it would continue. The political and strategic logic of maintaining pressure on a target as visible and symbolically significant as the Brest submarine base did not allow for simply abandoning the campaign because the concrete was proving harder than expected. It allowed for reassessment, for adaptation, for the introduction of heavier weapons and different tactics, but not for withdrawal. The Allied air forces had committed to Brest, and Brest had committed back, absorbing the blows and standing unchanged above the water. The next chapter of this particular contest would be louder, larger, and more costly than what had come before. It would also, as the evidence was beginning to suggest, produce very nearly the same result. By the spring of 1943, it had become clear to Allied planners that the preliminary bombing campaign against Brest had failed to achieve its objective. The concrete roofs of the submarine pens, thick enough to absorb the force of conventional bombs, had proven their worth in dozens of raids. RAF bombers had paid in blood for each sortie, losing crews to German fighter interception and anti-aircraft fire. Yet the pens remained operational, their massive bulk still sheltering U-boats that continued to hunt Allied convoys across the Atlantic. The question facing the British and American air commands was not whether to continue attacking Brest, but how to intensify the effort sufficiently to destroy the fortress that conventional bombing had failed to breach. The decision once made would escalate the campaign from a tactical nuisance into an industrial-scale assault that would consume resources, lives, and civilian lives in quantities not yet imagined. By mid-1943, American heavy bombers joined the British effort in growing numbers. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases in East Anglia, dispatched waves of B-17 flying fortresses toward the Breton coast. These daylight raids represented a fundamentally different approach than the RAF's night bombing. American doctrine held that precision bombing in daylight, with massed formations for mutual defense, could destroy specific targets with greater accuracy than the night campaigns. The theory was sound, the practice proved far more costly. German fighter squadrons, alerted to the incoming bombers by radar and observer networks, rose to meet them with increasing ferocity. The skies over Brest became contested territory where American and British crews fought not against concrete and steel, but against German pilots whose determination to defend their homeland had only hardened as the war turned against Germany. Each raid now became a multi-front battle, bombers fighting to reach their targets, fighters battling to defend them, and anti-aircraft gunners on the ground throwing up walls of flak that filled the sky with jagged metal. The strategic logic behind the escalation was clear enough. The U-boats operating from Brest, though increasingly vulnerable to Allied convoy escorts and new anti-submarine weapons, still represented a significant threat to the Atlantic supply lines. Destroying the pens might not end the U-boat menace, but it would force the Kriegsmarine to disperse its submarine force to other bases, reducing efficiency and extending transit times for operational patrols. The pens themselves had become a symbol, If the Allies could destroy this German fortress, it would demonstrate that no structure, however heavily fortified, could resist air power. Conversely, if Brest could not be breached, it would cast doubt on the entire air campaign strategy that had consumed so many resources and so many lives. The bombing, therefore, became almost as much about proving a doctrine as about destroying a military installation. The concrete fortress had become a test case, and the Allies were determined to win, regardless of cost. The raids of 1943 grew steadily in intensity as the months progressed. In January, American bombers struck with 31 aircraft. By March, formations exceeded 100 bombers. The attacks expanded beyond the immediate submarine pen complex to target the surrounding infrastructure, the shipyards, where U-boats were repaired, the fuel storage facilities, the ammunition depots, the rail yards that supplied the fortress. German engineers, working under constant threat of attack, had to divide their efforts between repairing bomb damage and extending the defensive capabilities of the installation. Anti-aircraft gun positions multiplied around the harbor. Flak towers rose higher. Underground shelters proliferated. The fortress, already an engineering marvel, began to take on the appearance of a hedgehog, bristling with defenses, capable of attacking anything that approached too closely. Yet beneath these visible preparations, stress fractures were beginning to form in the German command structure. The resources devoted to defending and maintaining Brest grew exponentially, consuming concrete, steel, fuel, and manpower that might have been deployed elsewhere along the German-held coasts. Casualty rates among the bomber crews climbed with brutal consistency. American airmen learned quickly that formation flying, while offering mutual defensive firepower against fighters, made them vulnerable to concentrated flak bursts. A single burst of anti-aircraft fire could damage multiple bombers flying in tight formation. Pilots described the sensation of flying through a storm of shrapnel, feeling their aircraft shudder and lurch as metal tore through aluminum fuselage and wings. German fighters, growing more desperate as their homeland faced the mounting bomber offensive, attacked with suicidal determination. Rookie American pilots, fresh from training in the United States, found themselves facing veteran German pilots in the skies over Brest. The attrition rate began to exceed replacement rates. Entire crews, 10 men per bomber, highly trained and irreplaceable in the short term, vanished in seconds when a bomber was hit by flak or rammed by a fighter. The cost of the campaign, measured in human lives, was mounting toward a threshold that would eventually force strategic reassessment. By summer of 1943, the bombing had expanded in geographic scope to include not only Brest itself, but the entire surrounding region. The city of Brest, a working French port with a civilian population, had become collateral damage in the campaign against the submarine pens. Residential neighborhoods, hospitals, schools, and markets lay within the blast radius of bombs intended for military targets. The line between precision and area bombing, already blurred by the limitations of 1943 technology, became increasingly ambiguous as the scale of the bombing intensified. American bombardiers, flying through flak and fighter attacks, did their best to place their loads accurately, but accuracy was measured in hundreds of yards in the best conditions. Brest's civilian population, already suffering under German occupation, rationing, and forced labor conscription, now faced the additional terror of constant aerial bombardment. Hundreds of civilians died in the raids. Entire blocks of the city were reduced to rubble. The fortress under the Atlantic coast, built by German hands and defended by German soldiers, had become a magnet for destruction that fell upon the French civilians living nearby. The moral calculus of the campaign became increasingly troubling to some Allied commanders. The strategic justification that destroying the submarine pens would cripple German naval operations and protect Allied convoys seemed to erode with each passing month as the concrete fortress remained fundamentally intact and operationally viable. The damage to civilian infrastructure was mounting, but the pens themselves, protected by their massive concrete roofs and reinforced walls, continued to shelter U-boats. Some British commanders questioned whether the effort was justified, whether the destruction being inflicted on Brest was proportional to the military advantage gained. American commanders, more committed to the doctrine of strategic bombing, continued to press the offensive. The political pressure to demonstrate that air power could win wars, that bombers could deliver victory without need for a costly ground invasion of Europe, made it difficult to scale back or redirect the campaign. The bombing continued and intensified, driven as much by institutional momentum and doctrinal commitment as by careful strategic calculation. The German defenders, meanwhile, demonstrated remarkable engineering ingenuity in adapting to the campaign. Damage repair teams worked constantly, patching bomb damage, filling crater holes in the concrete, and shoring up weakened sections before they could be exploited in subsequent raids. The pen's internal structure was modified to improve damage control. New bulkheads were installed, escape routes were expanded, and repair shops were decentralized to prevent single bomb hits from crippling multiple systems. German officers, recognizing that Brest had become a resource sink, consuming disproportionate quantities of personnel and material, began documenting the damage in meticulous detail, perhaps for the historical record, perhaps as evidence for post-war claims about the durability of the fortifications. The fortress adapted, evolved, and hardened itself against the assault. Yet the very intensity of the defenses, the mountains of concrete poured, the endless reconstruction work required, all of this was a form of bleeding, slow and relentless. The resources devoted to keeping Brest operational and defended could not be deployed to threaten sectors of the coastline or to the production of new weapons systems needed elsewhere on the German perimeter. By autumn of 1943, the campaign had reached a sort of equilibrium, not a balance between attack and defense, but a grim stalemate. The Allies continued to bomb. The Germans continued to repair. The submarine pens remained intact and operational, if somewhat reduced in capacity. The surrounding city lay in ruins. Hundreds of bomber crews had been killed or captured. Hundreds of German fighter pilots had fallen. The U-boat threat, meanwhile, was beginning to diminish, not because of the Brest bombing campaign, but because of factors unfolding beneath the Atlantic. New escort tactics, improving sonar technology, and the deployment of escort carriers had begun to shift the balance decisively against the submarines. The fortress that had been built to dominate the Atlantic found itself gradually becoming less important to German naval strategy, even as the Allied effort to destroy it continued unabated. This was the cruel irony of the Brest campaign. As the pen's strategic value declined, the bombing intensified. The fortress had become as much a monument to inertia and institutional commitment as a legitimate military target. The French population of Brest, observing the destruction falling upon their city, found themselves in a uniquely agonizing position. They were being bombed by the Allies, their liberators, in order to destroy German military installations. The fortress under the Atlantic coast had become an anvil upon which their city was being hammered. There was no way to distinguish between military and civilian zones when bombs fell from 30,000 feet. There was no way to calculate whether the destruction of the pens would be worth the price paid by the inhabitants of Brest. These were not abstract questions. They played out in the concrete reality of destroyed homes, dead children, and grieving families. The occupation was oppressive, but at least it was survivable. The liberation bombing was destroying their city in real time. Some French citizens harbored resentment toward the Allies, even as they recognized that the Germans were the ultimate source of the conflict. The moral complexity of strategic bombing, which had seemed clear enough in the planning rooms of the air commands, became murky and troubling when measured against civilian suffering. The German command structure, meanwhile, was reaching its own grim conclusion about the viability of maintaining Brest as a major naval installation. The costs of defense, in anti-aircraft ammunition, in fighter aircraft and pilot training, in construction materials and labor, were spiraling upward while the strategic value of the installation declined. The U-boat force operating from Brest was itself shrinking as losses in the Atlantic mounted, and new construction could not keep pace with attrition. The fortress had been built on the assumption that Germany would maintain naval superiority in the Atlantic for years to come. By 1943, that assumption had become a fantasy, yet the installation had acquired a kind of autonomous existence within the German bureaucracy. It consumed resources, demanded maintenance, and required defense. But its original purpose had largely evaporated. The bombing campaign, rather than forcing a German reassessment of strategic priorities, had instead locked Germany into a commitment to defend the fortress, investing ever more resources in an effort that offered diminishing returns. As 1943 drew to a close, the campaign against Brest had established a pattern that would continue for many months. Intense bombing, stubborn German defense, adaptation and repair, and a slow erosion of both the city and the German resolve to maintain the installation. The submarine pens themselves, the original target, remained largely intact and functionally operable, a proof of the soundness of their engineering and the limitations of air power against heavily fortified targets. Yet the broader campaign had revealed the true cost of modern warfare, not in the dramatic destruction of a single fortress, but in the grinding attrition of resources, lives, and strategic coherence on both sides. The fortress under the Atlantic coast had become a test case, not of engineering superiority, but of the terrible calculus of modern industrial warfare, where victory and defeat were measured not in the destruction of enemy fortifications, but in the ability to sustain effort and absorb losses in pursuit of increasingly marginal strategic gains. The bombing would continue, the fortress would endure, and the price would be paid by all who lived in its shadow. The bombs kept coming, but they never seemed to breach the walls. By the spring of 1943, the Brest submarine pens had already endured more than a dozen major air raids. British and American bombers had poured thousands of tons of ordnance onto the installation, yet when the dust cleared and the smoke dissipated, the massive concrete structures remained standing. The German engineers and architects who had conceived this fortress beneath the Atlantic coast had done their work so thoroughly that conventional bombing alone could not crack it. But the very survival of the pens posed a new challenge: how to maintain and adapt a structure that had to serve a fleet whose operational needs were constantly evolving. The answer lay not in retreat or resignation, but in a systematic program of reinforcement, modification, and expansion that would occupy German engineers and labor forces throughout 1943 and into 1944. The initial damage assessments following the RAF raids revealed that while the main concrete roofs remained intact, secondary structures had suffered considerably. Warehouse roofing had been torn away, ammunition storage compartments had been damaged, and the surrounding infrastructure, crane systems, fuel storage tanks, and auxiliary buildings, bore the scars of sustained bombing. German engineers approached these damages not as catastrophic failures, but as challenges requiring systematic solutions. Within weeks of each raid, work crews would descend on the damaged sections, clearing debris, shoring up weakened areas, and beginning reconstruction. The scale of this effort was staggering. At any given time during 1943, more than 3,000 workers moved through the pens and surrounding areas, performing maintenance, reconstruction, and new construction simultaneously. The facility never fully shut down for repair work. Instead, portions of it would be sealed off, while other areas continued operating, creating a constantly shifting maze of active submarine bays and construction zones. The engineers in charge of Brest's maintenance and upgrades worked under the direction of command staff, who understood that the pens had become far more valuable as the war progressed. As German U-boat losses mounted and the Battle of the Atlantic turned increasingly against the Kriegsmarine, the operational basing advantage provided by Brest became even more critical to maintaining an effective Atlantic campaign. Submarines sheltered here could reach the convoy routes far more quickly than those operating from German home ports, and the protected anchorage meant that damaged vessels could be repaired without exposing them to British naval attack or air power. This transformed Brest into not merely a storage facility, but an active, mission-critical installation whose upkeep directly influenced Germany's ability to wage naval warfare. The engineers recognized this burden and responded with meticulous attention to structural integrity. They began a comprehensive program of adding additional concrete layers to areas that had shown stress under bombing. In some sections of the main pens, workers poured reinforced concrete over existing walls, creating double and even triple layers in places where bombing had indicated vulnerability. This reinforcement process was methodical and extensive. German engineers studied the damage patterns from the raids, noted which areas had suffered the most punishment, and targeted those zones for upgrading. The eastern wall of the primary submarine shelter, which had absorbed the most direct hits from RAF bombers, attempting to penetrate the reinforced structure, received particular attention. Additional concrete was poured not only on the exterior, but also in reinforcing patterns within the existing walls, essentially creating a thicker, more resilient barrier without removing the original structure. This approach allowed the pens to remain operational even as they were being strengthened. The work proceeded through spring and summer of 1943, carried out by thousands of workers, laboring in multiple shifts around the clock. The concrete trucks never stopped arriving, and the sound of machinery and construction was constant, broken only by the occasional air raid alert that forced everyone to shelter in place. The workers themselves, mostly conscripted French labor and pressed workers from occupied territories, moved through the pens in a steady stream, performing increasingly familiar tasks as the reinforcement program evolved into routine maintenance. Beyond the concrete reinforcement, German engineers undertook a comprehensive internal modification of the pen's structure and layout. The original design had been optimized for U-boats of the type Willich class, the workhorses of the Atlantic campaign. But by 1943, the Kriegsmarine was beginning to introduce larger, more advanced U-boat designs, including the Type Ur XC, which required more space for maneuver within the protective bays. German engineers redesigned interior crane systems and repositioned support infrastructure to accommodate these larger vessels. They reconfigured repair bays and modified dock configurations to allow simultaneous servicing of different submarine classes. This was not merely a matter of rearranging existing equipment. It required careful structural analysis to ensure that the modifications did not compromise the integrity of the reinforced concrete walls. Engineers calculated load-bearing capacities, reinforced support columns, and ensured that the massive concrete roof would continue to distribute weight effectively even with new equipment configurations. The work proceeded with the kind of methodical precision that German military engineering had become known for, each modification tested and verified before implementation. Damage control systems were substantially improved during this period of systematic upgrades. The original pens had included basic compartmentalization, but the reinforcement program allowed for more sophisticated subdivision of the shelters. German engineers installed additional bulkheads and watertight doors throughout the complex, creating a series of isolated compartments that could be sealed in case of catastrophic damage or flooding. If a bomb or shell penetrated the outer layer and breached the interior, these compartments would limit the extent of potential damage and allow the facility to continue operating in other sections. Electrical systems were redundantly wired to ensure that power loss in one section did not cripple operations throughout the entire facility. Ventilation systems were upgraded with backup equipment and secondary air intakes, positioned to reduce vulnerability to damage. Water supply and drainage systems were rerouted and reinforced to prevent total system failure if any single point of the infrastructure was damaged. These upgrades reflected a sophisticated understanding of how modern fortifications needed to function under sustained assault. The defensive systems surrounding the pens multiplied dramatically throughout 1943, as the reality of the bombing threat became ever more apparent. Anti-aircraft gun emplacements were expanded and relocated based on observed bombing patterns and calculated angles of approach for Allied aircraft. Heavy flak batteries were installed around the perimeter of the base, with overlapping fields of fire designed to create a maximum density lethal zone for attacking bombers. Lighter anti-aircraft weapons were positioned on and around the pens themselves, turning the massive concrete structure into a gun platform as well as a shelter. Barrage balloon systems were installed to force bombers to higher altitudes where accuracy would be compromised. Searchlight positions were established and integrated into a fire control system that could coordinate multiple gun batteries against incoming aircraft. The defensive infrastructure became so extensive that the U-boat pens transformed from a pure shelter facility into a defended fortress in the full military sense. The guns themselves became targets, and bomber pilots would focus on destroying the anti-aircraft defenses as a prelude to attacks on the main installation. Camouflage efforts, which had been ongoing since the pen's initial construction, were intensified and elaborated throughout 1943. German engineers recognized that while they could not hide the massive concrete structures themselves, they could work to disguise their purpose and minimize the visual cues that would draw bomber attention. Elaborate false superstructures were erected around and partially over the pens, designed to resemble legitimate port infrastructure, while actually serving as dummy targets or deflection screens. Netting and painted canvas were used to obscure the geometric patterns of the pens that might be recognizable from the air. Fake damaged areas were created in nearby neighborhoods to suggest that previous bombing had crippled the facility, a psychological operation aimed at convincing Allied planners that continued bombing of Brest was yielding diminishing returns. Elaborate flak towers were constructed that resembled industrial structures, serving dual purposes as gun emplacements and camouflage elements. Smoke-generating systems were installed that could rapidly obscure the entire harbor area when air raid warnings sounded, reducing visibility and making precision bombing far more difficult. The engineering innovations at Brest during this period represented some of the most advanced fortress-building concepts being employed anywhere in World War II. German engineers drew on their experience with other heavily fortified installations across Europe, adapting and improving techniques as they learned from bomb damage and warfare experience. They studied the effects of different bombing loads on concrete structures, conducted stress tests on reinforced walls, and refined their understanding of how to build structures that could survive unprecedented levels of explosive bombardment. The knowledge accumulated through damage assessments following each raid was systematically analyzed and applied to the reinforcement program. If a particular design feature had proven inadequate, it was replaced with something more robust. If a reinforcement technique had proven effective, it was expanded and applied throughout the facility. This represented a learning curve being executed in real time, with an operational military installation serving as the experimental laboratory. The workers who carried out this massive construction and reinforcement program worked under conditions of increasing difficulty as 1943 progressed. The frequency and intensity of air raids accelerated as American bomber forces arriving in Britain began adding their weight to the campaign against Brest. The intervals between raids compressed, and workers had to rush to complete sections of work before the next bombing assault would interrupt progress. Many workers suffered injuries from unexploded ordnance or partial building collapses. Supply lines for concrete, steel reinforcement, and construction materials were themselves subject to bombing and air attack, creating chronic shortages. The conscripted labor force, increasingly drawn from populations skeptical of German victory, required strict military supervision to maintain productivity. Yet despite these obstacles, the reinforcement program continued relentlessly. The German military command understood that maintaining Brest's operational capacity was essential to preserving whatever advantages the Kriegsmarine could retain in the Atlantic, and they poured resources into the effort accordingly. By the end of 1943, the U-boat pens at Brest had been fundamentally transformed by the reinforcement and modification program. The installation was thicker-walled, more compartmentalized, and more sophisticated in its damage control systems than it had been at the beginning of the year. The defensive anti-aircraft armament had multiplied several times over. The interior configuration had been modified to accommodate new U-boat designs and to improve repair and maintenance efficiency. Yet paradoxically, even as the fortress had been growing stronger and more formidable, the strategic situation that gave it meaning was deteriorating. The U-boat fleet was suffering unprecedented losses to improved Allied anti-submarine technology and tactics. Fewer submarines were operating from Brest as the year progressed, not because the pens were inadequate, but because the Kriegsmarine submarine force was being systematically destroyed in the Atlantic. The fortress was being made ever more resilient, precisely as its purpose was becoming progressively obsolete. The engineers and workers, toiling at Brest in 1943, were not aware of this tragic contradiction, but it was already written into the mathematics of the war's progress. The strongest fortress cannot protect a fleet that is being annihilated. The adaptation of Brest represented both a triumph of engineering ingenuity and the ultimate futility of trying to solve strategic problems through defensive fortification. German planners had chosen to pour enormous resources into making Brest an impregnable shelter for U-boats, believing that the protection of the base would translate into operational advantage in the Atlantic. What they had failed to fully account for was that the real competition in the Atlantic was not about fortress strength, but about firepower, positioning, and the fundamental balance between hunter and hunted. The reinforced concrete walls could not stop the deeper technological and tactical evolution that was turning the U-boat arm from predator into prey. The anti-aircraft guns could not prevent the relentless increase in bomber numbers and improved bombing accuracy. The camouflage systems could not hide the fact that fewer and fewer U-boats were actually operating from Brest, a reality that would eventually become visible to any observer of the harbor. The modifications to accommodate larger, more advanced U-boats could not compensate for the fact that the fleet was shrinking, not growing. Brest in 1943 remained formidable and impressive, a testimony to German engineering under pressure. But it was a fortress waiting for a mission that was becoming increasingly unlikely to materialize. The stronger it became, the more it resembled a monument to a fleet that was already ceasing to exist. In the spring of 1943, the Atlantic was no longer the domain of the Kriegsmarine. The vast ocean that had seemed, just months before, to belong entirely to the German U-boat fleet had transformed into something far more hostile, a contested wilderness where the hunters had become the hunted. The turning point came not from a single catastrophic defeat, but from a convergence of factors: new Allied tactics, evolving technology, and the simple arithmetic of attrition that Germany could no longer sustain. The wolf packs that had ranged freely across the convoy routes in 1942, sinking merchantmen with impunity, now found themselves stalked by enemies they could not always see. The pens at Brest, that monument to German industrial power, had been built to shelter submarines embarking on campaigns of dominance. By the middle of 1943, they had become monuments to a vanishing dream. The change began below the surface, in the realm of underwater acoustics and electronic detection. The Allies had developed new sonar technology, crude by later standards, but revolutionary in its moment, that could locate submerged submarines with increasing accuracy. Escort vessels accompanying merchant convoys now carried devices that transformed the hunt from a game of surface spotting and luck into something more akin to a science. The U-boats, bred in the tradition of surface attack, where their superior speed and firepower meant dominance, found themselves forced to submerge and remain submerged for extended periods. Underwater, they were slower, less capable of maneuvering, and increasingly vulnerable to coordinated attacks from multiple escort ships working in tandem. The technical advantage that had belonged to Germany for nearly 3 years was slipping away, measured in decibels and electromagnetic frequencies that the submariners themselves could scarcely comprehend. But technology alone does not win wars. The Allies had also learned the hard way how to protect convoys, and this hard-won knowledge spread through the Royal Navy and American naval forces like a species finding its ecological niche. The old system, a few scattered escort vessels guarding merchant ships spread across vast stretches of ocean, had proven catastrophically inadequate when U-boats attacked in coordinated packs. The answer was saturation. More escort vessels, better trained, operating under unified doctrine. By 1943, convoys sailed with dedicated escort groups, sometimes numbering a dozen or more warships. These escorts practiced coordinated maneuvers against U-boat attacks, developing procedures for detecting submerged submarines and maintaining contact even when the target went deep. The merchant ships themselves, armed now with defensive weapons and sailing in tight formations, presented a far harder target than the scattered, vulnerable convoys of 1942. A U-boat commander approaching such a convoy faced not 3 or 4 potential threats, but a coordinated wall of defensive firepower. The human element transformed alongside the technological and tactical shifts. In 1942, many U-boat crews had been experienced, seasoned by months of successful patrols. Their commanders enjoyed a comfortable advantage over the Allied escort crews, who were often hastily trained and inexperienced in anti-submarine warfare. By 1943, attrition had reversed this equation. Skilled U-boat captains and experienced crew members were gone, sunk with their boats, or transferred to training duties to instruct the next generation. The fresh crews filling the pens at Brest and other bases had sometimes only weeks of training. They faced Allied escort captains and crews who had now conducted dozens of convoy operations, who had weathered U-boat attacks, who understood the tactics and psychology of underwater warfare. This was not a condition that would improve for Germany. Each month that passed moved the advantage further toward the Allies, who had both superior numbers of trained personnel and the industrial capacity to train more. The convoy that sailed in May of 1943, designated ONS-5, exemplified this transformation. It was a routine Atlantic crossing, a gathering of merchant vessels carrying supplies across the ocean to support the war effort. A wolf pack descended on the convoy, with the confidence born of months of success. 42 U-boats converged on ONS-5, and they would sink over a dozen merchant ships in the engagement. By any measure of the 1942 campaign, this represented success. Yet the cost proved catastrophic. 6 U-boats were sunk in the battle, either destroyed by escort vessels or so damaged that they had to be written off as lost causes. Several others sustained damage that would require weeks of repair. For the Kriegsmarine, losing 6 U-boats to sink 13 merchant vessels was a trade that could no longer be sustained. The mathematics of production were brutal and unforgiving. Germany could not replace those lost submarines and their crews as quickly as they were being destroyed. The Allies could. The statistics that summer painted a grim picture for German naval leadership, though some grasped the reality more quickly than others. In May of 1943, the Kriegsmarine lost 23 U-boats across all operations, a staggering single-month loss. In June, another 17 boats went down. The combined British and American shipyards, running at full capacity, were producing merchant ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. The replacement rate for U-boats could no longer keep pace with losses. Every boat that went down represented a capital investment in construction, equipping, and training that might never be recovered. More importantly, every boat represented irreplaceable human expertise. A young captain with 2 years of successful patrols, a commander with the judgment born of experience. These men could not be replaced by simply building a new hull and training a new crew. The margin was narrowing, week by week, and the strategic trajectory had shifted irrevocably. The crews at Brest felt the change in their bones, though the fortress itself remained imposing and functional. The submarines returning from patrol now carried stories of increasing peril. Depth charges came in waves from above. Escort vessels appeared with new equipment, hunting techniques that made the old tactics obsolete. The losses among crews were accelerating. Boats that departed never returned, their fate to be absorbed gradually into silence. The camaraderie among submariners, the sense of belonging to an elite force waging a technological war against the Allies, began to curdle. The pens that had seemed like sanctuaries when the U-boats were winning now felt more like the last refuge of a declining power. Young sailors arriving for their first posting found themselves surrounded by men whose eyes reflected something other than the confidence of victors. The fortress under the Atlantic coast had been built to project German power. By the autumn of 1943, it had become a repository for a losing fleet. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, recognized the crisis with painful clarity. Where some German military leaders clung to optimism or rationalized deteriorating conditions, Dönitz understood what the numbers meant. He had built the U-boat fleet on the premise that Germany could inflict losses on Allied shipping faster than the Allies could build replacement vessels, and faster than they could develop countermeasures. Both of these premises had collapsed. The Allies were building more tonnage than was being sunk. They had developed countermeasures that made U-boat operations exponentially more dangerous. The logic of the campaign, which had seemed sound in 1942, was now inverted. Dönitz understood that he faced a choice: continue sending U-boats to the Atlantic, where losses mounted beyond justification, or withdraw and seek a different strategic role for the submarine fleet. This was not a decision made lightly, or with optimism about future prospects. It was the reluctant acknowledgement of a military situation that had become untenable. The decision to concentrate U-boats in the Atlantic had represented one of the major German strategic choices of the war. Hundreds of submarines had been committed to this theatre, built in response to Dönitz's ambitions and German naval strategy. The pens at Brest, Saint-Nazaire, and La Pallice represented the physical manifestation of this commitment. They had been built at tremendous cost and effort, consuming raw materials and skilled labor that might have been applied elsewhere in the German war effort. They had been designed to support a U-boat campaign that would bring Britain to its knees through starvation and industrial collapse. By 1943, this entire strategic conception had become obsolete. The pens stood empty of purpose, sheltering boats that were no longer victors but refugees. The fortress under the Atlantic coast had been built in anticipation of dominance that had never materialized and had ceased to exist. The internal debates within German naval command grew increasingly urgent and acrimonious. Some officers argued for intensifying U-boat deployment, for introducing new technologies and tactics that might restore the advantage. Dönitz himself authorized development of boats with improved underwater performance, faster boats equipped with snorkels that would allow them to run diesel engines while submerged. These represented genuine technical innovations, yet they were fundamentally defensive measures, attempts to survive in an environment that had become hostile rather than efforts to reclaim the initiative. The reality was that time had become the Allies' ally and Germany's enemy. Every month that passed allowed the Allies to train more escorts, to deploy more convoy protection, to increase the production of merchant shipping. The window of opportunity that had existed in 1942 had closed. It had not shut gradually, but had slammed with the force of technological development and tactical innovation that Germany had underestimated. The operational tempo at Brest began to shift in ways both obvious and subtle. Fewer U-boats departed for patrol. The maintenance cycles for returning boats grew longer as engineers struggled with increasing damage and wear. The sense of expansion and growing power that had characterized the base in 1942 gave way to something more akin to preservation. German command was no longer asking how to expand U-boat operations, but how to sustain what remained in the face of mounting losses. The men who had built the pens, the engineers and construction workers who had labored in 1941 and 1942, had envisioned their creation as the foundation of a new era of German naval dominance. Instead, they had built a fortress for a fleet that was dying. The concrete walls, several meters thick and impervious to bombing, could not protect against the true sources of vulnerability: inferior numbers, deteriorating technology, and the slow attrition of trained personnel. By the end of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had effectively been lost from the German perspective. The Kriegsmarine would continue U-boat operations, would experiment with new technologies, would pursue limited campaigns against Allied shipping. Yet the decisive moment had passed. The moment when U-boats might have inflicted enough damage to cripple Allied war production had vanished into the past. The pens at Brest, fortress under the Atlantic coast, had been built to shelter the submarine fleet during its hour of triumph. Instead, they would shelter a defeated remnant, a declining force that could no longer threaten the Allies' ability to wage war. The turning of the tide was not marked by a single dramatic event, but by the accumulation of losses, the erosion of advantage, the realization that the strategic premise on which the entire campaign rested had become an obsolete fiction. The hunters had become the hunted, and the fortress built to celebrate their victory had become the mausoleum of their defeat. By 1944, the strategic reality facing the German Navy had undergone a profound transformation. The submarines that once departed from Brest with confidence now faced an ocean transformed into hostile territory. Allied escort vessels had grown more numerous, their tactics refined through bitter experience. Radar swept across the waters with increasing sophistication, hunting in darkness as effectively as daylight. New weapons, depth charges, hedgehogs, ahead-throwing mortars, turned the depths into a minefield of invisible danger. The U-boat crews knew it. Command knew it. The fortress at Brest, for all its concrete grandeur, could no longer shelter a victorious fleet. Instead, it held the remnants of a navy, fighting for mere survival, and Brest itself, nestled on the Breton coast, was becoming a trap. American and Free French forces were driving eastward through France, with momentum that seemed unstoppable. The Germans faced a choice that grew more urgent with each passing week: break out from Brest before encirclement closed the noose, or watch their capital ships and remaining submarines become prisoners of geography. The Kriegsmarine's command structure wrestled with an impossible calculus. The pens at Brest still functioned, still sheltered vessels, but the base's vulnerability had become undeniable. To the east, American columns pushed deeper into Brittany. To the north, the English Channel remained under Allied dominance, a watery barrier now transformed into something far more dangerous, a highway patrolled by destroyers, motor torpedo boats, and fighter aircraft that could appear within minutes of any sighting. Breaking out would require timing, audacity, and luck in measures that seemed increasingly scarce. Yet remaining meant eventual capture or destruction at the dock. The decision, therefore, was made with the grim clarity that comes when all alternatives promise disaster. The vessels sheltering at Brest, surface raiders, U-boats, smaller escort craft, would attempt a dispersal. Some would try to break out to the south, slipping down the coast toward the Atlantic and the possibility of reaching other German-held ports or neutral waters. Others would attempt the more perilous northern route, running up the English Channel in daylight, banking on speed and the chaos of aerial combat to carry them through. The planning for these breakout operations occupied German naval officers through the winter and spring of 1944. The vessels involved included destroyers and torpedo boats, fast enough to make a run for it, yet still valuable enough to warrant the attempt. U-boats posed a different problem entirely. The larger Type 9 submarines, designed for distant patrol, could make the transit, but they moved at surface speeds far slower than destroyers. Submerged, they were virtually immobile for long distances without exhausting battery reserves. The Germans developed a solution, born of desperation. The U-boats would attempt the passage submerged during darkness, timing their dives to avoid daylight hours when aircraft posed maximum threat. Those that could not make the transit would remain at Brest, becoming either targets for bombing or prisoners when the fortress fell. The moral weight of these decisions fell on the shoulders of men who understood they were orchestrating what might become a catastrophe. Yet the alternative, doing nothing, guaranteed that very outcome. So the preparations continued, resources were gathered, fuel was cached, and crews were assembled for operations that would unfold across the spring and summer of 1944. The first major breakout attempt came in the spring, involving several fast warships determined to force their way northward through the English Channel. The operation, codenamed by the Germans with characteristic directness, was mounted with full awareness of its peril. The vessels selected were among the most modern in the Kriegsmarine's inventory, ships that had already demonstrated their capability under fire. The plan called for a high-speed dash in daylight, betting that speed and surprise would carry them through before Allied forces could mount a coordinated response. The crews were informed of the danger with brutal honesty. They would face RAF and American fighter bombers within minutes of being sighted. They would encounter British naval forces, destroyers, motor torpedo boats, coastal defense vessels. The waters through which they would travel had been contested for years, every mile of it known intimately to British defenders. To succeed meant reaching open water east of Dover, then either finding refuge in German-held ports or, if necessary, neutral waters where they could at least avoid immediate destruction. On the appointed day, the vessels prepared for departure. Crews that had sheltered in the Brest pens for months now manned their battle stations with the certainty that survival would depend on minutes of sustained combat and nerve. The morning broke clear, conditions that had been chosen specifically because cloud cover could not be relied upon, and the Germans preferred to trust speed over concealment. The ships moved out of the harbour and set course for the English Channel, their hulls cutting through water that had seen countless naval actions over the previous 4 years. The silence of the pens was broken by the roar of their engines, and for the first time in months, the Kriegsmarine's largest vessels were making their presence known across the surface of the contested waters. Radio operators monitored frequencies, listening for the transmissions that would signal the first sighting. They did not wait long. Within minutes, the reports began flowing in. British coastal radar had detected them. RAF fighter-bomber squadrons scrambled from airfields across southern England. The race was on. The running battle that followed was fierce and fragmented, a series of engagements that lasted hours and stretched across dozens of kilometers of the English Channel. German ships returned fire with their anti-aircraft armament, throwing up barriers of flak that filled the sky with steel and noise. RAF Spitfires and American fighters pressed their attacks, diving through that defensive fire with courage that bordered on recklessness. Vessels were hit, some sustaining damage that crippled their ability to fight, others taking punishment that would have sunk them had the water been any deeper or the crews any less skilled. The engagement unfolded in the sight of British and American spotters on shore, adding a surreal dimension to the battle. People ashore witnessed the Kriegsmarine making what amounted to a daylight raid on its own behalf, attempting to flee rather than impose its will through strength. The symbolic power of that reversal was not lost on anyone observing. The ships that had once seemed invincible, that had driven all before them in the early years of war, were now running, fighting desperately, just to escape a trap of geography and circumstance. The operation succeeded, but not completely. Several vessels made it through the channel, damaged but still mobile, reaching German-held ports where they could be repaired and refitted. But the cost was higher than anyone had anticipated. Ships sustained damage that would take months to repair, time that Germany no longer possessed. Several smaller craft were lost, or forced to limp back to Brest. Crews suffered casualties that would take time to replace. Officers and men trained in warfare at sea, irreplaceable in their expertise. The moral impact, however, may have been even more significant than the material cost. The successful breakout of some ships proved that escape was possible, but only barely, and only with losses that seemed to confirm the underlying reality. The Kriegsmarine had lost command of the channel. What had once been a German-controlled waterway, occasionally raided by British forces, had become a contested zone where the Allies held decisive advantage. The Germans could contest it, could inflict damage through skillful ship handling and gunnery, but they could no longer move freely through it as they once had. The U-boats attempted their own dispersals with varying success through the following weeks. These operations unfolded with less visibility than the surface ship breakouts, but no less danger. Submarines attempting to clear the pens and reach the open Atlantic faced a gauntlet of Allied anti-submarine forces that had been honed by years of convoy escort work. A single U-boat moving on the surface, vulnerable and slow, was potential prey for any Allied destroyer, frigate, or fast patrol craft within detection range. Some U-boats attempted the passage submerged during hours of darkness, timing their transit of the most dangerous waters to coincide with periods when Allied air patrols were least active. Others tried to move with sufficient speed on the surface to outrun slower pursuits, gambling that they could reach deep water before being overtaken. Success rates varied. Some submarines made it into the Atlantic, joining other boats that had already evacuated or been transferred to new bases. Others were damaged in transit and had to return to Brest for repairs they could not afford to delay for. Still others were detected and attacked, forced to dive to dangerous depths to escape, emerging damaged and demoralized. What these operations revealed, more than anything else, was the fundamental shift in naval power that had occurred over the previous year. The U-boats that departed from Brest in 1944 were not the confident predators that had once operated with near impunity across the Atlantic. They were beleaguered, operating in an ocean that had become increasingly lethal, hunting shipping that was now protected by escorts, armed with weapons specifically designed to destroy submarines. The pens that had been built to shelter a triumphant fleet were instead serving as a launching point for boats engaged in a delaying action, trying to inflict damage on an enemy that had grown too numerous and too capable to defeat. The breakout operations of 1944, seen from this perspective, were not dramatic escapes, but rather the final phase of strategic collapse, being managed through military competence and operational skill. The Germans were losing the naval war. That fact was now undeniable. What remained was determining how that loss would be managed and how much additional damage could be inflicted on the enemy before the outcome became irreversible. The human cost of these operations was substantial, but often remained hidden in the larger narrative of the war's final year. The crews manning the vessels, whether surface ships or submarines, knew they were participating in desperate operations with uncertain outcomes. Many survived the breakout attempts, reaching new bases and continuing to serve in the Kriegsmarine until its final surrender. Others did not survive. Some were lost when their vessels were sunk in combat. Others were captured when vessels that failed to complete their transit were forced to surrender. Still others endured the psychological burden of repeated close calls, the knowledge that survival often seemed to come down to chance rather than skill or courage. The submariners, particularly, bore a weight that extended beyond individual operations. They understood that the U-boat arm was in terminal decline, that their efforts in 1944 were essentially futile in strategic terms. Yet they continued, motivated by professional obligation, crew loyalty, and the simple fact that surrender was not an option available to them under the military system in which they served. The dispersal of the Brest flotilla marked the beginning of the end for the base as a functioning military installation. As vessels departed, the pens gradually emptied of their primary purpose. The fortress that had been built to shelter a powerful fleet now stood increasingly empty, its vast concrete chambers no longer filled with the activity and purpose they had been designed to accommodate. German command recognized the writing on the wall, but determined to hold the facility as long as possible, transforming it into a stronghold to be defended, rather than a base from which operations could be launched. Resources that had been devoted to submarine maintenance and repair were redirected toward defensive preparations. Supplies of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts that could not be evacuated were organized for destruction rather than capture. The change in the base's function was subtle but absolute. It had transitioned from an offensive weapon in the naval war to a potential prize in the land war that was approaching from the east. By the summer of 1944, the pens at Brest represented something far different from what they had been in 1942 and 1943. They had been a symbol of German naval power, evidence of industrial capacity and engineering prowess. They were now an anachronism, a fortress designed for one purpose, increasingly serving a different purpose entirely. The breakout operations of spring and early summer demonstrated that vessels could still escape, that the Kriegsmarine retained the capability to execute complex operations under difficult circumstances. But they also revealed the fundamental weakness underlying all German naval strategy in 1944. The possession of formidable weapons and excellent crews counted for very little when you were losing the broader war, when industrial capacity was declining, when the enemy possessed superiority in numbers, quality of equipment, and strategic initiative. The U-boats and surface ships that fled Brest were buying time, delaying the inevitable, but not changing its ultimate outcome. The fortress under the Atlantic coast had served its purpose, and was now becoming a relic of a naval power that was rapidly ceasing to exist. In the depths of 1943, the Atlantic delivered a verdict that no concrete fortification could overturn. The U-boat pens at Brest, those massive monuments to German industrial will, began their slow descent from purpose into obsolescence. Not because enemy bombers breached their walls or ground forces overran their corridors, but because the submarines that sheltered within them were dying at sea. The wolf packs that had terrorized Allied convoys now faced systematic annihilation. Sonar technology improved by the month. Escort vessels multiplied and coordinated with precision. Aircraft equipped with searchlights and depth charges hunted at night. The statistical reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The U-boats sent from Brest returned in diminishing numbers. Many never returned at all. The fortress that had consumed years of labor and mountains of concrete now harbored fewer and fewer hunters to justify its existence. By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had fundamentally shifted. The Kriegsmarine's own records told a story of accelerating disaster. In May of that year alone, the German submarine fleet suffered losses so catastrophic that Admiral Karl Dönitz, the man who had commanded the U-boat arm with tactical brilliance and iron will, faced an impossible choice. The convoy system had matured into a lethal gauntlet. Allied merchant ships now traveled in formations, screened by destroyers, corvettes, and frigates, equipped with sonar, what the Germans called ASDIC, capable of detecting submerged targets at distances and with accuracy that rendered the submarine's traditional stealth advantage marginal. Escort carriers accompanied convoys across the Atlantic itself, something unthinkable just months before. Aircraft could now remain on station for hours, extending the reach of naval power hundreds of kilometers beyond the sight of any ship. The technological scales had tipped irreversibly toward the defense. The men inside the pens at Brest understood this transition, though they could not speak of it openly. The submarine crews who arrived for patrol briefings noted the absence of familiar faces. Entire boat crews vanished into the Atlantic. The officers who commanded from the pens watched their fleet strength statistics decline with each monthly report. The spare parts inventory, once managed with meticulous German precision, began to shift from replacement components to cannibalization projects. When one U-boat returned damaged, its intact equipment no longer went into stores but into other boats. The pens that had been designed to shelter a growing armada now faced the opposite problem, maintaining a shrinking fleet with diminishing material. The morale among the submariners who passed through Brest during this period was peculiar, a strange mixture of fatalism and professionalism. These were experienced sailors who knew the mathematics of their situation, but chose to continue, to maintain discipline, to do their duty, despite the incomprehensible odds. The logistical apparatus that had supported the pens began to show strain in ways both subtle and dramatic. Fuel deliveries from German refineries once regular and abundant, became sporadic and inadequate. The Allies had begun targeting the oil infrastructure of German-occupied Europe with methodical precision. Romania's oil fields, which had supplied much of the Kriegsmarine's fuel, faced increasing air raids. The tanker fleet that moved crude oil and refined petroleum to bases like Brest shrank as Allied submarines and aircraft destroyed merchant vessels faster than replacements could be built. Inside the pens themselves, storage tanks that had been kept nearly full began to show gaps. Submarines conducting patrol operations could no longer fuel up completely before departure. Some boats had to choose between maximum weapons load and maximum fuel endurance. Others conducted shorter patrols in nearby waters, rather than the distant hunting grounds of the mid-Atlantic. The fortress on the French coast had been built to project German power across an ocean. Now it struggled to keep its remaining boats supplied for operations in increasingly contested waters. The German High Command's assessment of Brest's strategic value underwent significant recalibration during the latter months of 1943. The facility consumed enormous resources, not only the original construction costs and materials, but ongoing garrison maintenance, defensive upgrades, and supply logistics. The Wehrmacht required concrete, steel, and labor across multiple theaters. The Russian front demanded constant reinforcement. The Mediterranean had become a contested zone. The Atlantic coast itself required fortification against the inevitable Allied invasion. Officers reviewing resource allocation began asking uncomfortable questions. How many submarines actually sheltered in the pens at any given time? What was the return on investment in maintaining a massive facility for a fleet that was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced? The debate was not conducted in public forums or in the pages of newspapers, but in staff meetings and written assessments that circulated among high-ranking officers. Some argued for maintaining Brest as a symbol, a demonstration of German resolve and capability. Others advocated for consolidating the submarine fleet into fewer bases that could be defended more efficiently. The tension between ideology and practical calculation began to show. The physical appearance of the pens during this period would have struck any observer as paradoxical. The structures themselves remained intact. Those massive concrete roofs, several meters thick, stood unchallenged by the aerial campaign. The internal compartments were well maintained by German engineering standards, kept clean and organized despite the pressures of continuous operation. And yet the facility increasingly wore an air of underutilization. The docking slots designed to shelter a dozen submarines at a time might hold only 2 or 3. The repair shops, once clanging with the sound of active maintenance, became quieter. The administrative offices that coordinated patrol operations, once crackling with radio traffic and written orders, handled an increasingly sparse schedule of departures and arrivals. German officers who had served at Brest during the earlier years of the war noted the change with a kind of melancholy recognition. They had been present during the heights of German success, when the facility represented the cutting edge of naval warfare and national power. Now, they oversaw the slow diminishment of that power, day by day, patrol by patrol, loss by loss. The human element of this obsolescence cannot be separated from its technical dimension. The men who crewed the U-boats sheltering in Brest during 1943 carried knowledge that few others possessed. They had seen the Atlantic change. They understood in their bones and their nerves what it meant to operate in waters increasingly dominated by enemy air power and surface escorts. Young officers fresh from training programs sometimes arrived at Brest with expectations shaped by the glorious myths of earlier U-boat victories. The experienced crews educated them quickly and brutally. Discussions in the quarters at Brest took on a resigned quality. Men spoke of friends lost, boats presumed destroyed, operations that achieved nothing despite enormous risk. The democratic instinct to question orders was impossible in a military structure as rigid as the German Navy, but the questions existed in the silences between conversations. The superstition that inevitably attached itself to submarine service intensified as losses mounted. Old boats that had survived multiple patrols were considered lucky and crewed accordingly. New boats were sometimes approached with foreboding, as if statistical likelihood could be evaded through faith or ritual. The pens at Brest, built as a fortress, had become a place where men contemplated mortality. The strategic calculations of the German High Command regarding Brest's future became increasingly transparent to Allied intelligence. The Allies read German radio traffic with remarkable effectiveness through their Enigma machine intelligence. They understood that the Kriegsmarine was struggling to justify maintaining Brest as an active base. They knew that fewer U-boats were departing from French ports, and that many of those that did depart never returned to port. They were aware that German engineers were investing effort in other potential submarine bases, particularly in Norway, which offered better defensive positions against Allied air power and surface forces. This intelligence reinforced Allied strategic thinking. The Allies recognized that they were in the process of winning the Battle of the Atlantic, not through the direct destruction of the Brest pens, which had proven nearly impervious to bombing, despite enormous effort and cost, but through the destruction of the submarines themselves. The fortress was becoming irrelevant, not because it could be breached, but because what it was meant to shelter was being systematically eliminated. This realization transformed the strategic calculus around Brest. The facility would remain a target, but less as a priority for bombing, and more as an objective to be captured when land forces advanced into Brittany. By the final months of 1943, the German submarine command had already begun to shift focus away from the Atlantic campaign that Brest had been built to support. Admiral Dönitz, recognizing that the conventional submarine strategy had failed, began advocating for technological development of new U-boat types with greater speed and endurance, equipped with advanced breathing apparatus that would allow them to remain submerged indefinitely. These revolutionary vessels would require different basing infrastructure than the conventional submarines sheltered in the Brest pens. They would need bases positioned for different operational areas and protected by different defensive systems. The future that Dönitz envisioned did not include Brest as a central facility, but relegated it to a supporting role for older, less capable boats. The engineering marvel that had taken years to build and millions of Reichsmarks to complete was being overtaken by technological and strategic considerations that would determine the next phase of the naval war. The concrete walls remained, massive and strong, but the strategic geography of the conflict had shifted around them. What had been the fortress at the heart of German naval power was becoming a peripheral installation defending a dwindling fleet. The emotional and psychological atmosphere within the pens during this transition was peculiar and difficult to articulate. The structure itself was a triumph of human engineering. The precision of the concrete work, the ingenuity of the internal compartments, the sophistication of the systems designed to repair and maintain submarines. The men who worked within it took pride in this accomplishment, even as they accepted that it could not reverse the broader collapse of German naval ambitions. There was a strange contradiction at the heart of Brest in 1943, a place of remarkable achievement, populated by men who understood, with increasing clarity, that their achievement was being rendered obsolete by forces they could not control or overcome. The Kriegsmarine's officers and men maintained their discipline, their professionalism, their adherence to duty. There was no public dissent, no rebellion against the system. And yet the writing on the walls, both literal and metaphorical, became increasingly legible. The fortress under the Atlantic coast, built to endure bombardment and assert German control over the sea, could not endure the simple reality that the war was being lost. The material condition of Brest during this period reflected these broader trends. Maintenance continued, but it was sometimes performed with a kind of ritual quality, going through the established procedures because they had always been performed, not necessarily because anyone believed they would alter the outcome. Supply deliveries that had been regular and abundant became irregular and sparse. German logisticians performed miracles of improvisation, but improvisation is fundamentally reactive rather than creative. The shortages that plagued Germany's entire war economy were felt acutely at Brest. Spare parts became precious. Workers performed repairs to extend the service life of aging equipment. The sophisticated machinery that had been installed in the pens during their construction was being maintained at minimum acceptable levels rather than optimal levels. The decay was slow and subtle, but real. An observer visiting Brest in the autumn of 1943 would see a fortress that appeared nearly intact, well-maintained, and professionally operated. That same observer, familiar with Brest during its height in 1942, would have recognized something more troubling, the appearance of vitality masking the reality of decline. The question of what would become of Brest occupied German strategic thinking throughout the latter part of 1943 and into 1944. Some officers argued that the fortress should be strengthened further, that additional defensive measures against eventual Allied ground assault should be implemented immediately. Others suggested that resources poured into Brest would be better spent elsewhere. The Nazi ideology that had driven the construction of the pens originally, the vision of a 1,000-year Reich controlling European seas, had collided with the material reality of defeat spreading across multiple battlefields. The submarines that the pens were meant to shelter continued to sortie, continued to take casualties, continued to achieve less and less with each passing month. The fortress remained, concrete and steel, massive and seemingly impregnable. Yet it was becoming an anachronism, a monument to German ambition, built at the moment when German ambition was about to be reversed. By late 1943, it was apparent to anyone with eyes to see that Brest faced a future very different from the one its architects had envisioned. The pens would endure, but they would endure as a conquered enemy stronghold, captured and studied, and eventually preserved as historical artifact. The submarine fleet they had been built to shelter was being erased from the Atlantic, scattered, destroyed, relegated to the past. The fortress was becoming history even as it stood. The summer of 1944 brought a transformation across Western Europe. On the 6th of June, Allied amphibious forces had struck the beaches of Normandy, establishing a foothold that no German counterattack could dislodge. In the weeks that followed, hundreds of thousands of troops poured across the Channel and into France. American, British, and Canadian forces broke out from their initial beachheads, liberated towns that had endured 4 years of occupation, and began the long drive eastward toward Germany itself. The momentum of the Allies seemed unstoppable. German forces that had seemed invincible in 1940 retreated before the advancing tide, leaving behind abandoned equipment, devastated supply lines, and growing despair among commanders who understood that the war's direction had fundamentally shifted. For the inhabitants of Brittany, the approach of liberation felt imminent. The province, jutting out into the Atlantic, had served as a German possession and fortress for nearly half a decade. Now, with American and Free French forces driving toward the peninsula, the hours of occupation appeared numbered. In the fortress city of Brest, German commanders faced a choice that would define their final months. They could abandon the submarine pens, the harbor installations, and the massive fortifications that had consumed such enormous resources, and withdraw their garrison deeper into German-held territory. Alternatively, they could prepare a defense, transforming Brest into a fortress in miniature, a German stronghold that would hold out as long as possible against the advancing enemy. The decision reflected a broader pattern in Nazi military strategy. During 1944, the leadership in Berlin increasingly favored holding on to positions at any cost, a doctrine that would lead to the destruction of city after city and the pointless deaths of thousands of soldiers in the final months of the war. Yet, even as the German High Command issued orders to stand and fight, practical realities began asserting themselves in Brest. The U-boat campaign had already collapsed. Fewer and fewer submarines sheltered in the pens with each passing month. The strategic rationale for defending the pens, to protect bases for Atlantic operations, had evaporated. What remained was honor, prestige, and the refusal to admit that the fortress that had seemed so permanent, so powerful, had become a liability. The garrison commander who would face the coming siege was Oberst Eugen Würzbach, an officer who understood both the strength of his fortifications and the weakness of his position. No fortress, however formidable, could withstand indefinite bombardment and assault when the enemy controlled the skies and possessed overwhelming numbers. Yet orders from higher command were explicit: hold Brest. Defend the submarine pens to the last man if necessary. The German military tradition of obedience ran deep, and Würzbach would comply. He began immediately to prepare for a siege, positioning his available troops, assessing the fortress's remaining defensive capabilities, and stockpiling supplies. His garrison numbered several thousand men, soldiers from various Wehrmacht units, military personnel who had staffed the port facilities, and naval troops assigned to defend the installations. They were not elite assault troops or battle-hardened paratroopers, but ordinary German soldiers who understood that the war was lost and that they now faced a slow, grinding defensive campaign with no hope of relief or rescue. The submarine pens themselves became the focal point of Brest's defensive strategy. These massive concrete structures, which had been built to protect U-boats from aerial attack, now took on a new strategic function. Their thick walls, their numerous compartments, their labyrinthine interior spaces, all of these features that made them invaluable, as submarine shelters made them equally valuable as military strongpoints in urban combat. The pens could accommodate hundreds of soldiers in their various chambers, providing protection from artillery fire and aerial bombardment. Their compartments could be converted into defensive positions, ammunition storage, command centers, and medical facilities. The concrete that had been poured to keep enemy bombs out could be equally effective at keeping enemy bullets out. German engineers and commanders began stockpiling equipment, ammunition, food, and water within the pens. Medical supplies were stored in the deeper chambers. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover approaches to the pen entrances. Machine gun positions were established at vantage points overlooking the harbor. The pens transformed from industrial installations into fortresses within a fortress, layers of protection stacked upon one another. The broader defensive perimeter around Brest was strengthened as well. Barbed wire, anti-tank obstacles, and minefields were laid out across the terrain surrounding the city. German engineers constructed fighting positions, machine gun emplacements, mortar pits, and observation posts, from which defenders could engage approaching enemy forces. The city itself, with its buildings and narrow streets, offered natural defensive advantages that German commanders understood well. An attacker would be forced to fight through a complex urban environment where visibility was limited, movement could be ambushed, and heavily fortified positions could exact a high price for each block gained. Bunkers were constructed in key locations throughout the city. Ammunition and supplies were distributed to strengthen the defensive positions. Orders went out that certain buildings would be barricaded, certain intersections held at any cost, certain strong points maintained even if isolated. The psychology of fortress defense, the belief that a well-defended position holding sufficient supplies could withstand siege indefinitely, took hold among the garrison. In reality, the fortress had a fatal weakness. It depended on supply lines that the enemy would soon sever completely. As August 1944 began, the approaching American forces intensified their pressure on the Brittany Peninsula. Units of the American 8th Army under General Omar Bradley drove south and west toward Brest, cutting across Brittany and isolating the fortress from German-held territory. French forces, fighting alongside the Americans, moved toward their homeland with particular determination. For France, the liberation of Brest represented more than a military objective. It symbolized the expulsion of the occupiers and the restoration of French sovereignty. The Americans and French forces began encircling Brest in late August, gradually tightening the noose around the fortress. German supply convoys, attempting to reach the besieged garrison, were attacked and destroyed. The roads leading into Brest were cut. The fortress became increasingly isolated, dependent entirely on whatever supplies were already stockpiled within its perimeter. The submarine pens, which had been designed to function independently for extended periods, became critical infrastructure for sustaining the defense. Water systems, power generation, food storage, all of these installations were tested for their ability to support a besieged garrison. The mood within Brest transformed as the reality of the encirclement became apparent. The garrison had been given orders to hold, but they increasingly understood that no relief would arrive, that no reinforcements would break through the siege lines, that the fortress would eventually fall. The question became not whether Brest would be captured, but when, and at what cost in German lives. Würzbach, the fortress commander, maintained discipline and enforced the orders from higher command, but he was no fool. He began conserving ammunition, rationing food, and husbanding the resources in the pens to extend the garrison's ability to resist. He also prepared psychological preparations for what would inevitably become a grim, grinding siege, a conflict where defenders would be slowly starved, battered, and attrited until they could no longer resist. Letters from the garrison to higher command expressed concern about supplies, ammunition, and the condition of the troops. The responses from Berlin and from intermediate headquarters offered little comfort. Stand firm. Hold the fortress. Your sacrifice will be remembered. These were the messages sent to men who increasingly understood they were being sacrificed for symbolic purposes rather than strategic ones. The American and French forces surrounding Brest during late August and early September 1944 represented overwhelming material advantage. They possessed artillery, armor, aircraft, and thousands of infantry troops. They had supply lines stretching back to ports, now under Allied control. They had reinforcements arriving daily. The Germans, by contrast, were cut off, isolated, and facing inexorable attrition. Yet even an isolated, encircled garrison in a fortress can fight for weeks or even months if it has supplies, ammunition, and the will to resist. The submarine pens, with their vast storage capacity, represented the fortress's best hope for a protracted defense. The Germans had enough ammunition to conduct an extended defensive campaign. They had enough food to keep the garrison fed, though rationing became tighter with each passing day. They had fortifications that could inflict significant casualties on attacking forces. The question that confronted Würzbach and his officers was whether prolonging the defense served any purpose. The war was already lost. No amount of heroic defense at Brest would change the outcome of the broader conflict. Yet orders were orders, and military tradition demanded obedience. The submarine pens themselves took on an almost haunted quality during these final weeks, before the siege intensified. The vast compartments that had once sheltered U-boats now sat mostly empty. The submarines had long since departed, sent to other bases, or sunk in the Atlantic. The repair facilities that had once bustled with hundreds of workers stood largely idle. The pens remained intact, their massive walls untouched by the countless bombing raids that had failed to penetrate their concrete. Yet they had become monuments to a war that was ending, to German industrial power that could construct but not prevail. German sailors and workers, who had once moved through these spaces with purpose, now moved through them as part of a garrison preparing for siege. The pens became repositories for ammunition, food, water, and weapons. They became underground barracks where soldiers slept on concrete floors. They became command centers where officers planned a defense they did not believe would succeed. The engineering marvel that had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine had transformed into a fortress where men prepared to endure bombardment, starvation, and eventually defeat. The material preparations for siege reached their peak in the final days of August and the first days of September. Supplies brought in during the previous weeks were inventoried, organized, and distributed throughout the defensive positions. Water supplies were tested and sources secured. Communication systems, telephone, wireless, and runners were established to maintain command and control throughout the fortress. Medical facilities within the pens were prepared for what all understood would be significant casualties. Ammunition was moved to accessible locations near the fighting positions, where it would be needed when the assault came. Food rations were calculated based on estimates of how long supplies might need to sustain the garrison. The precision of these preparations reflected the German military tradition of detailed planning and systematic organization, applied now to the grim task of surviving a siege they could not win. Morale among the troops was mixed. Some soldiers saw honor and duty in defending the fortress to the end. Others, particularly those who had fought in Russia or witnessed the collapse of German military power across Europe, questioned the purpose of further bloodshed. Yet discipline held. Orders were obeyed. The fortress was prepared. By early September 1944, Brest was completely surrounded. The outer ring of the encirclement was established with American artillery positioned at ranges from which they could bombard the fortress at will. French forces held other sectors of the siege line. Supply lines into the fortress were completely severed. Escape routes were cut off. The garrison was trapped, exactly as the strategic situation had dictated would eventually occur. The submarine pens stood ready, their compartments filled with the material of war. The fortress within the fortress was prepared for the assault that everyone knew would come. Würzbach, the German commander, received the signal to expect the American attack within days. The American commanders, Bradley and his subordinates, looked at the fortifications surrounding Brest and understood that the coming assault would be costly, grinding, and potentially protracted. Neither side anticipated that the siege would last for nearly a month, that weeks of bombardment would precede the final assault, or that the submarine pens would become the final bastion of German resistance in one of the oldest cities in Brittany. The fortress under the Atlantic coast had evolved from a base for submarine operations into a military strongpoint in its death throes. The historical irony was complete. The pens built to extend German power across the Atlantic would ultimately shelter the last defenders of German France, fighting a battle that had already been decided elsewhere on the continent. By the summer of 1944, the German garrison at Brest faced a closing vice. American forces had broken out from the Normandy beachhead and were driving south and west with accelerating momentum. Free French units, fighting alongside their American allies, surged toward Brittany with the dual purpose of military necessity and national liberation. The German command structure in France was in chaos. Leadership had fractured, and the coherent defense of outlying positions was becoming increasingly impossible. Yet at Brest, the German garrison commander made a fateful decision. The fortress would be held. This choice transformed the U-boat pens from a naval installation into something far more desperate, the core of an urban siege, where concrete designed to shelter submarines would shelter instead the last soldiers defending a doomed position. The fortress that had been built to master the Atlantic would be defended until the last moment, not because it could win, but because German military culture demanded the sacrifice. The German commander at Brest, Admiral Jean-Philippe Auboino, along with supporting officers, understood their situation with brutal clarity. Supply lines from Paris had been severed. The Kriegsmarine's presence had dwindled to almost nothing, with only a handful of operational boats remaining in the harbour and the vast majority of the pens sitting empty. Reinforcements from other sectors were impossible. Every unit was needed elsewhere as Allied armies pressed deeper into France. The garrison numbered roughly 4,800 men, mostly naval personnel, Kriegsmarine infantry, and scattered Wehrmacht troops. Against them came advancing American forces, estimated at over 20,000 strong, along with multiple Free French units burning to reclaim their homeland. The mathematics of the situation were stark and unforgiving, yet German military tradition, wounded pride, and the ideological imperative to resist to the last inspired the commander to prepare the fortress for a siege rather than surrender to what German officers viewed as inevitable humiliation. As August 1944 unfolded, the closing American and French noose tightened around Brest. German engineers and soldiers reinforced the submarine pens with additional defensive positions, transforming the installation's internal geometry from a shelter for naval vessels into a labyrinth of strongpoints. The massive concrete walls, never breached by Allied bombers, now served a different strategic purpose. They became the skeleton of an urban fortress, compartmentalized and nearly impossible to clear room by room. Machine gun positions were established at critical junctures, where corridors intersected. Anti-tank obstacles were placed at entrances and exits. Ammunition and food stores were distributed throughout the complex, in case attacking forces managed to penetrate one section and force defenders deeper into the structure. The pens, in their monumental architecture, accidentally provided ideal conditions for desperate defensive warfare. What had been designed as sanctuary from air attack became sanctuary from ground assault, offering protection that worked equally well whether the threat came from above or below. The civilian population of Brest, numbering over 40,000 souls, found themselves trapped in an urban battle zone between an unstoppable invading army and a garrison determined to defend every stone. German forces withdrew the civilian population further from the pens and the harbour toward the southern sections of the city, attempting to create a buffer zone between themselves and the advancing Allies. Supplies for the civilians grew scarce. Water systems failed from battle damage. Makeshift shelters replaced destroyed homes. The promise of liberation, only weeks away, felt like a distant dream for people enduring bombardment and displacement. Some civilians attempted to flee eastward, toward areas controlled by German forces further inland, risking the chaos of a collapsing military situation. Others huddled in basements and ruins, hoping the battle would end quickly. The fortress that had embodied German power now embodied only German desperation. and the city paid the cost in suffering inflicted on its own population. American and Free French forces reached the outskirts of Brest in early August and immediately made contact with German defensive positions. The fighting was bitter and methodical, the kind of urban combat that devours soldiers and ammunition with equal hunger. The submarine pens, looming on the coastline, became both a physical obstacle and a psychological focal point. Allied commanders recognized that as long as German forces held the pens, they maintained control of the harbor and could potentially conduct harassing operations against Allied shipping or landing craft. More importantly, the pens' capture would serve as a symbolic conclusion to the campaign, the destruction of the fortress that had held the Kriegsmarine's most advanced operations. Attack after attack was launched against the German perimeter, defending the pens and the surrounding port facilities. German defenders, though outnumbered and increasingly desperate, fought with the discipline and tenacity that German soldiers had demonstrated throughout the war. Each street became a contested zone. Each building became a small battlefield unto itself. Inside the pens, the garrison organized into defensive sectors, with officers and non-commissioned officers taking positions at key strongpoints. The compartmented structure of the installation meant that if one section was lost, defenders could retreat deeper into the complex and prepare new defensive lines. Ammunition supplies, while initially adequate, began to dwindle as resupply from outside the fortress became impossible. Food rations were cut. Water, once plentiful, had to be rationed as damage to the harbor infrastructure disrupted normal supplies. German soldiers understood they were fighting not for victory, but for survival, and for the preservation of honor in a cause that was already lost. The pens, despite their massive construction and defensive advantages, began to feel less like a stronghold and more like a trap, a place where men would make a last stand while the war raged and turned decisively against everything they had fought to achieve. Morale was strained, though discipline held firm in the ranks of professional soldiers and naval personnel. The battle for Brest intensified throughout September. American and French artillery pounded the German positions continuously, with particular focus on the submarine pens and the surrounding fortifications. Artillery shells, heavier and more numerous than the bombs that had rained down during the earlier air campaign, struck the concrete structures with relentless force. While the main walls of the pens resisted the bombardment, compartments within suffered damage. Supporting structures were damaged or destroyed. Blast waves from nearby explosions killed men through concussive force alone. German defenders began to experience something new and terrifying. Their fortress was not impregnable. The concrete that had withstood years of bombing campaigns was proving vulnerable to sustained artillery fire at close range. More critically, the massive pens could be surrounded and contained, eliminating any possibility of escape or maneuver. The fortress that had been built to project power was now a prison from which there was no exit except through the advancing enemy or through surrender. As the siege pressed on into mid-September, the full horror of the German strategic situation became undeniable, even to the most committed officers. Outside Brest, the broader campaign for France was being decided. American forces had swept across the landscape toward Germany itself. The Siegfried Line was being approached. German commanders elsewhere were contemplating the fact that the war itself would be lost within months. Yet at Brest, isolated and surrounded, German soldiers fought for a city that no longer mattered to anyone except those trapped within it. Supplies were nearly exhausted. Wounded men accumulated in underground compartments of the pens, unable to be evacuated, treated with improvised medicine by naval medical personnel. The German command made repeated assessments of whether continued resistance served any purpose. To surrender meant captivity, and the shame of being the only German garrison to fall to Allied assault before the final collapse. To continue fighting meant watching men die for nothing, watching a fortress built with tremendous effort and sacrifice become a grave. The compartmented nature of the U-boat pens became cruelly relevant as fighting moved closer to the installation itself. Defenders who had used the pen's passages and chambers to organize their defense now found themselves compressed into smaller and smaller defensive zones. American and French forces, advancing cautiously into the vast concrete structure, encountered fierce resistance at every stage. German defenders, using the pen's geometry to their advantage, inflicted casualties on the attackers, despite their growing weakness. But the mathematical logic of siege warfare was inexorable. As each compartment was lost, the German defensive perimeter contracted. As supplies dwindled, the ability to sustain resistance diminished. The pens, which had once represented the future of German naval power, had become a monument to futility. Men died there, German soldiers, American soldiers, and Free French fighters, in a battle for rubble and concrete that changed nothing in the broader war, except to add another chapter to its catalogue of sacrifice. By late September, the German garrison faced the final reckoning. American and Free French commanders, aware that the fortress could not hold indefinitely and unwilling to spend more lives on siege warfare, intensified pressure for surrender. They issued ultimatums and allowed brief periods for negotiations. The German commander, after days of increasingly desperate calculation, came to the conclusion that further resistance would only add to the loss of life without affecting the outcome. Supplies were nearly gone. Ammunition was measured in hours of fighting, not days. Wounded men were suffering with minimal medical care. The order came down finally to cease resistance and surrender to the advancing Allies. German soldiers, who had fought at Stalingrad and Kursk, who had held Mediterranean positions for years, who had defended their homeland with ferocity, now laid down their arms at a fortress in Brittany that had never fulfilled its intended purpose. The surrender at Brest occurred in late September of 1944, weeks after the broader Normandy campaign had definitively shifted the war's trajectory. German troops emerged from the submarine pens and from fortified positions throughout the city, their weapons grounded, their uniforms dust-covered and stained. American and French soldiers entered the pens and found a fortress large and strange. Vast concrete chambers, designed for submarines, now filled with ammunition caches, command posts, medical stations, and sleeping areas for hundreds of soldiers. The pens had sheltered the Kriegsmarine from bombs. They had sheltered German soldiers from artillery, but they had not sheltered anyone from the inexorable logic of defeat. The fortress that had been built to dominate the Atlantic had become a ruin in a city that was finally, after nearly 5 years of occupation and warfare, returning to French hands. The battle for Brest was over. The battle for Europe was entering its final phases, and the submarine pens, still largely intact despite all that had fallen upon them, stood as a physical reminder of the gap between what military engineering could build and what military strategy could actually achieve, when the broader tide of war turned decisively and irrevocably against you. The summer of 1944 was drawing to a close when the first American guns opened fire on Brest. The city had endured months of bombing from above, but now it faced something different, a grinding, methodical assault from the ground. By late August, American forces under General Troy Middleton had pushed their way into Brittany, cutting off German defenders from any hope of reinforcement or retreat. The submarine pens, which had once stood as symbols of German maritime dominance, now found themselves at the center of a desperate urban battle. What had been designed as an impregnable fortress against air attack would soon discover that fortifications can be attacked from directions their builders never anticipated. The soldiers closing in on Brest understood something crucial. They had to take this city, and they had to do it completely, regardless of the cost. The German commander at Brest, General Hermann Ramke, faced a decision that most military leaders in his position had already made elsewhere: surrender or fight to the end. Ramke chose to fight. He had been ordered to hold the fortress, and he interpreted that order with the rigid determination that had characterized much of the German officer corps throughout the war. His garrison, composed of roughly 3,000 combat troops drawn from various Wehrmacht units, naval personnel, and even some Luftwaffe ground crews, dug in around the city's defenses. The submarine pens themselves became more than just a facility of historical importance. They transformed into the core of the defensive position. Their massive walls and multiple compartments offered natural strongpoints that no modern attacker could easily overcome. Ramke positioned his men with the grim knowledge that they would be fighting in an urban environment where every street corner, every building, and every section of the pens themselves could become a killing zone. The American forces approaching Brest were not unprepared for this assignment. They had already learned through hard fighting in Normandy and the breakout across France that German garrisons could be stubborn. General Middleton committed substantial forces to the reduction of Brest: infantry battalions, support companies, artillery units, and engineer detachments. The Americans brought with them field artillery, anti-tank guns, and heavy machine guns, the entire apparatus of modern combined arms warfare. By early September, they had encircled the city completely, cutting off any possibility of German escape or supply. The noose tightened day by day as American engineers worked to prepare siege positions, and artillery batteries dug in at ranges where they could pour fire into the defenders' positions. The scale of the operation reflected the strategic importance the Allies now assigned to Brest. It could not be left in German hands, as Allied forces pushed deeper into France, and it could not be simply bypassed and left as an armed garrison at their rear. The fortress had to be taken, and taken completely. Artillery became the dominant sound and presence of the siege as September unfolded. American guns, howitzers, field pieces, and heavy mortars fired day and night against Brest's defenses, with an intensity that grew as the days passed. The submarine pens, those engineering marvels with their meters-thick concrete roofs, proved almost as resistant to artillery as they had been to bombing. Shells that could shatter brick buildings and reduce wooden structures to splinters would strike the concrete and either deflect or crater the surface without achieving penetration. The Americans quickly understood that conventional artillery alone could not destroy these fortifications. Instead, they focused on suppressing German fire, destroying the buildings around the pens, where defenders sheltered and regrouped, and slowly, methodically, narrowing the perimeter where German defenders still held ground. Smoke hung perpetually over the city as buildings burned, and artillery fire added its own destructive force to what the bombing campaign had already done to Brest's civilian infrastructure. For the defenders inside the pens, each impact of shell fire sent vibrations through the concrete, a constant reminder of the hammering they were enduring and the inevitable outcome drawing closer. The fighting inside the city itself became a grinding, brutal affair that consumed time and lives in proportions that seemed disproportionate to what was being achieved. American infantry companies moved through the streets in short rushes, using buildings for cover, clearing rooms with grenades and rifles, advancing yard by yard against defenders who were not ready to surrender. The submarine pens became both a strategic objective and a tactical nightmare for the attackers. Their design, intended to shelter submarines and provide protection against air attack, also made them formidable defensive positions against ground assault. Multiple entrances and exits meant that defenders could move between different sections and compartments without being exposed to direct fire. Underground passages connected various sections, allowing German soldiers to reinforce threatened positions or withdraw to stronger defensive lines. The thick walls that had impressed German engineers when they were first poured now made the attackers' job exponentially harder. Every section had to be cleared methodically, every passage searched, every compartment assaulted, with the assumption that armed Germans waited on the other side of each doorway. Casualties mounted on both sides as the battle wore on through the 2nd and 3rd weeks of September. American soldiers died clearing rooms in the pens. German soldiers died defending positions they knew were ultimately lost, but which orders demanded they hold. The nature of urban combat meant that casualties often came not in dramatic charges across open ground, but in sudden bursts of machine gun fire, in explosions from hand grenades in enclosed spaces, in the countless small lethal encounters that characterized fighting through a fortified city. Medics worked constantly to move wounded back to aid stations. Litter bearers struggled through rubble-choked streets, carrying injured men to areas where they could receive treatment. The submarine pens, which had been designed as sanctuaries against the fury of modern warfare, became instead the setting for a form of combat that was intimate, personal, and unforgiving. Soldiers on both sides understood that they were fighting for concrete and steel that had no inherent value except what military commanders assigned to it. Yet they fought anyway, because that is what soldiers do when ordered to fight. German resistance, while determined, was gradually ground down by the sheer weight of American firepower and the steady advance of American infantry. The defenders were short on ammunition, short on food, short on water, and increasingly short on hope. Ramke's earlier determination to fight to the last man was not shared by all his soldiers, and isolated groups began surrendering as their positions became untenable. The submarine pens, which had originally been designed to accommodate dozens of submarines and the facilities to maintain them, now sheltered only German soldiers with nowhere left to go. The vast compartments that once echoed with the organized activity of a major military installation had become tomb-like, filled with the sounds of combat and the cries of wounded men. American soldiers clearing each section had to contend not only with active defenders, but also with wounded Germans who might still pose a threat, with booby traps left behind by men who understood that they were fighting a battle they could not win, and with the simple confusion and chaos that characterized all combat in confined spaces. The artillery continued to thunder throughout this period, maintaining a bombardment that never completely ceased. American gunners fired on German strongpoints, on suspected defensive positions, on areas where intelligence suggested ammunition or supply caches were located. The shelling wore on the defenders psychologically, even as it inflicted physical damage. German soldiers huddled in the pens knew that at any moment a shell could strike their position, could kill or injure men standing beside them, could collapse a section of wall and bury them under tons of concrete. The psychological weight of knowing that you are under siege, that the enemy grows stronger while you grow weaker, that reinforcement will never come and escape is impossible, is one of the heaviest burdens that a soldier can bear. Yet the defenders endured it day after day, hour after hour, fighting room by room, compartment by compartment, as the Americans slowly pushed deeper into the fortress. By the 3rd week of September, even General Ramke could see that the situation was becoming hopeless. His supply lines had been cut for weeks. His ammunition was running low. His men were exhausted from days of continuous combat. No relief force would arrive, because there were no relief forces left in France capable of lifting a siege. The Allied armies were advancing on all fronts, pushing deeper into French territory. Brest had become an isolated pocket that served no strategic purpose except as a symbol of German stubbornness. On the 21st of September, German representatives approached American lines under a flag of truce to discuss terms of surrender. The Americans presented straightforward conditions: lay down your weapons, cease firing, march out of the fortress and into captivity. Ramke, true to the rigid code of honor that had defined much of his military career, refused to surrender completely. Negotiations continued through the next day, with minor concessions granted on both sides regarding the treatment of prisoners and the evacuation of wounded. The artillery fire slackened somewhat as both sides awaited the outcome, though volleys still crashed into the city occasionally, as if to remind everyone that the killing could resume at any moment. The final German surrender came on the 22nd of September, 1944. Soldiers who had defended the fortress emerged from the submarine pens, with their hands raised, moving slowly through rubble-strewn streets toward American lines. They marched past the shells of buildings that had been reduced to concrete and steel frames, past craters where bombs and shells had torn the earth, past monuments to weeks of relentless combat. The submarine pens themselves, those massive engineering achievements that had consumed enormous German resources and been designed to be impregnable, had fallen not to bombing, but to ground assault and siege. The Americans who entered the pens saw a fortress that was largely structurally intact, but tactically defeated. The thick walls that should have rendered it invulnerable had instead made it a prison for the men inside. The compartments and passages that had been designed for operational efficiency became a maze that could only be cleared methodically by infantry assault. Engineers and intelligence officers began immediately inspecting the installation, documenting what they found, and assessing the damage inflicted by months of bombardment and 3 weeks of brutal fighting. The cost of taking Brest was substantial on both sides. American casualties during the siege totaled in the hundreds, killed and wounded. Men lost to capture a city that in purely strategic terms could have been bypassed. German casualties, both killed and captured, exceeded 1,000. The civilian population of Brest had already endured months of bombing. Now they emerged from their shelters to find much of their city in ruins, many neighborhoods reduced to rubble, their port facilities devastated, and their city occupied by American troops. The submarine pens stood amid this devastation, as testimony both to German engineering capability and to the reality that even the most impressive fortifications cannot guarantee survival when the larger war turns decisively against you. The fortress under the coast had been designed to dominate the Atlantic and ensure German naval supremacy. Instead, it had become a place where German soldiers fought and died in a battle that achieved nothing except delay the inevitable. The pens would remain in German hands for only a few more months before the war in Europe would be completely finished, and those massive concrete structures would be left standing as monuments to ambition divorced from reality. By late September of 1944, the garrison defending Brest faced a choice that had narrowed to a single, terrible option. For weeks, American and Free French forces had compressed the perimeter around the city, pushing German defenders into smaller and smaller pockets of resistance. The submarine pens themselves had become the final stronghold, a massive concrete citadel that seemed to promise one last stand, though everyone in the bunkers knew the promise was hollow. Supply convoys could no longer reach the fortress. Ammunition stocks dwindled with each passing day of sustained bombardment. Fresh water came from limited reserves. The men defending these structures understood that surrender was no longer a matter of if, but when. What remained was only the calculation of how long they might hold, and at what cost to themselves and their enemies. The Allied assault on the pens had transformed them into something their designers never anticipated: a fortress, engaged not against aerial attack, but against determined ground forces, advancing through the rubble of the city itself. Artillery shells that had failed to penetrate the thick concrete roofs found their targets in the compartments where ammunition and fuel were stored. Dynamite charges, carefully placed by American engineers at weak points in the structure, collapsed portions of the interior corridors and sealed off passages. German soldiers had fortified the interior of the pens with machine gun nests and anti-tank obstacles, creating a second line of defense within the fortification. But these preparations, however elaborate, could not overcome the fundamental mathematics of the situation. The Germans were outnumbered, outgunned, and increasingly desperate. The pens that had once represented the cutting edge of German naval power had become a tomb for the men trapped inside them. The final bombardment intensified on the 24th of September. American artillery positions, established in the ruins of the city, poured shells into the fortress with methodical precision. The ground trembled from the constant detonation of high explosives. Men sheltering in the deepest compartments of the pens felt the concussions even through the concrete, a physical reminder that even the strongest walls could not shield them from what was coming. The noise was relentless, an acoustic assault that wore on the nerves and tested the resolve of soldiers who had endured months of combat. Communication between compartments became difficult as explosions severed electric cables and damaged ventilation systems. The air grew thick with concrete dust. Wounded men filled every corner of the medical facilities inside the pens, and the doctors and medics had long since exhausted their supplies of painkillers and antibiotics. The situation had become untenable in every measurable way. German commander Colonel Hans von Schelliher, commanding the Brest garrison, recognized that continued resistance served no strategic purpose. The Atlantic fortress was no longer connected to any broader German offensive or defensive plan. The Third Reich itself was collapsing on all fronts. In the east, Soviet armies had recovered from the initial shock of the German invasion and were now pushing westward into Poland and toward Germany itself. In the west, the breakout from Normandy had succeeded, and Allied forces were advancing rapidly across France. Brest, defended to the last man, would not change these realities. Von Schelliher faced a choice between ordering his men to fight until the pens became their grave, or negotiating a surrender that would at least preserve some portion of his garrison. He chose surrender. The decision, though militarily rational, represented a profound admission. The fortress that was supposed to be unconquerable had fallen not to the weapons that built it, but to the conventional infantry and artillery of determined enemies. The negotiations for surrender began on the 25th of September. American commanders made clear that they would grant reasonable terms, but only if the German garrison laid down its weapons without further resistance. The fighting had already cost both sides grievously. The Americans had lost hundreds of men in the assault on Brest, and many more were wounded. The Germans had suffered equally heavy casualties, and they had no reserves to call upon, no reinforcements approaching, no prospect of relief. The practical calculation was straightforward, even if the emotional weight of surrender was difficult for soldiers who had been trained to fight until victory or death. Von Schelliher issued orders for his men to cease resistance. On the 26th of September, German soldiers began emerging from the submarine pens under white flags, moving into captivity with the expressions of men who had exhausted their ability to continue fighting. The moment when Allied forces first entered the intact submarine pens was marked by surprise and a certain grim satisfaction. The thick concrete walls had survived intact. The individual compartments, though scarred by explosions and battle damage, still stood. The fortification that had been designed to withstand any aerial assault had in fact survived the aerial assault, only to be forced to surrender to ground attack. American and British engineers who entered the pens catalogued the damage and marveled at the construction. The walls were several meters thick, made of reinforced concrete poured in multiple layers. The compartments were arranged in a pattern that had allowed German submarines to be sheltered and serviced, while remaining largely protected from observation and bombardment. Ventilation systems, electrical conduits, and water lines had been run through channels, cut into the concrete. The engineering was impressive, a genuine achievement of German industrial capacity and technical skill. But the fortification stood empty now, or nearly so. The submarines that it had been built to shelter were gone, lost in the Atlantic, or captured in other ports as the German naval system collapsed. The inventory of what the Allies found inside the pens revealed the scope of German preparations and the reality of German desperation. There were fuel storage tanks that had been drained or destroyed, ammunition magazines that had been detonated or carefully emptied, repair workshops equipped with specialized equipment for servicing submarines, now silent and abandoned, sleeping quarters for crew members, some still bearing the personal effects of men who had departed or been captured. The pens had been maintained by a large garrison of support personnel, engineers, mechanics, supply officers, medical staff, in addition to the submarine crews themselves. All of these people were now prisoners, or incorporated into the surrendered garrison. The facilities that had required over 10,000 workers to construct, and over 3 years to complete, had fallen in a matter of weeks of ground assault. The Kriegsmarine's pride in the fortress was replaced by the reality that it had become a liability rather than an asset. The scale of the prisoner haul from Brest was substantial. Over 6,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner in the final surrender of the garrison. These men represented not just combat troops, but the accumulated technical and support personnel who had maintained the base throughout its operational life. Many of them were conscripts, drafted into the Wehrmacht as Germany's military situation deteriorated. Some were volunteers who had joined the naval service attracted by the reputation of the Kriegsmarine. All of them were now in Allied hands, and they understood that the war for them had ended. The march into captivity was conducted in an orderly fashion. The Germans maintained military discipline even in defeat, forming up into columns and moving under guard toward prisoner of war camps. American soldiers watched them pass with the expressions of men who had fought hard to achieve this moment and who knew that many of their comrades had been killed or wounded to make this victory possible. The symbolic weight of the surrender was not lost on anyone who understood the broader context of the war. The submarine pens at Brest had been built in the confident days of German military ascendancy, designed as a fortress that would shelter the U-boats that Germany believed would strangle British merchant shipping and force Britain to negotiate peace. The pens had represented German technological superiority and industrial capacity. They had stood as a monument to German engineering excellence, but they had fallen not to the superior air power that they were designed to resist, but to conventional ground assault. This inversion of expectation was significant. The fortress that was supposed to defend Germany's naval power had instead become a symbol of its collapse. The thick concrete walls that had resisted bombing now became the walls of a prison for those who had built and maintained them. The destruction within the pens was catalogued carefully by Allied intelligence officers. The bombing campaign, despite its failure to breach the main shelters, had caused significant damage to the support facilities and the surrounding infrastructure. The shipyards where submarines could be repaired were largely destroyed. The fuel storage depots had been hit repeatedly and were now unusable. The electrical systems that powered the pens had been damaged and would require extensive repair. The ventilation systems had been partially collapsed by explosions. Despite the main structures being largely intact, the pens could not function as an active naval base. They were a fortress without a purpose, a monument to engineering divorced from practical use. The decision to maintain and defend them to the final surrender had consumed German resources and manpower that might have been deployed to more critical theaters. But by the time this calculus became apparent, the decision had already been made, and the commitment had been sustained through months of grueling combat. The fate of the garrison after surrender followed the standard procedures for prisoners of war. The enlisted men were marched to temporary camps and eventually transported. Officers were segregated and treated according to the Geneva Convention, which by 1944 was being reasonably observed by both sides, despite the atrocities that were being committed elsewhere in the war. Many of the men who surrendered at Brest had fought in North Africa or the Eastern Front before being assigned to garrison duty at the fortress. Their faces bore the weathering of years of military service and the strain of the final siege. The psychological effect of surrender after months of fighting varied from man to man. Some felt relief that the fighting had ended and they had survived. Others felt shame at giving up their position to the enemy. Most simply felt exhausted and wanted the war to be over, regardless of the terms. The aftermath of the capture of Brest marked a turning point in how the war was perceived by both combatants. For the Allies, the fall of the fortress demonstrated that no position, however carefully fortified, was truly impregnable against determined assault with sufficient resources and manpower. The lengthy campaign to capture the city and the fortress had cost more in time and casualties than some commanders had anticipated, but it had succeeded. For the Germans, the loss of Brest represented another irreplaceable piece of their collapsing defensive position. The Atlantic coast, which Germany had once planned to defend as a fortress against eventual Allied invasion, was now in Allied hands. The U-boats that had operated from Brest were either sunk, captured, or transferred to other bases. The dream of using the fortress as a bastion of German naval power had dissolved into the reality of surrender and occupation. The empty submarine pens would remain as a monument to a war already lost, though the fighting would continue for several more months across Europe. The concrete structures stood as testimony to the massive industrial effort that Germany had devoted to what ultimately became a losing military campaign. The Kriegsmarine, which had hoped to use these fortifications to achieve victory through control of the Atlantic, had been defeated by the very enemies against whom the fortress was designed to protect. In the decades to come, the pens would be preserved and eventually open to visitors who would walk through the empty compartments and try to comprehend the scale of effort and the finality of failure that the concrete represented. For now, though, they were simply the scene of a German surrender and the latest symbol of the Third Reich's decline toward inevitable collapse. The German garrison had surrendered in late September of 1944, and silence descended upon Brest like fog rolling across the Atlantic. For the first time in years, the massive concrete fortress beneath the harbor lay dormant, no longer humming with the purpose it was built to serve. Allied soldiers moved cautiously through the corridors and chambers, their footsteps echoing off walls that had been designed to withstand anything the world could throw at them. The engineers who followed in their wake carried clipboards and measuring instruments, tasked with something far more complex than conquest, understanding what they had actually captured. What emerged from their systematic survey was a profound irony that would define how history remembered this place. The fortress had survived the bombing campaign that was meant to destroy it. The fortress had endured months of artillery bombardment designed to crush it. Yet the fortress stood as testimony not to German victory, but to German irrelevance, for the submarine pens of Brest had become a monument to engineering effort that had utterly divorced itself from strategic reality. The scale of the installation confronted every engineer who entered it. The submarine pens stretched across the harbour in multiple clusters, each one a self-contained fortress within the broader fortress. The largest pens measured roughly 90 meters in length and could accommodate the largest Type 21 U-boats that Germany's shipyards were struggling to produce in dwindling numbers. The concrete roofs, which had proven nearly invulnerable to aerial attack, ranged from 7 to 10 meters thick in their protective layers. The walls shared similar proportions, reinforced with steel rebar, and designed according to calculations made when German naval planners believed the Kriegsmarine would dominate European waters indefinitely. Every structural decision reflected absolute confidence in German industrial capacity and German strategic victory. Every measurement spoke of engineers who had built not for temporary occupation, but for eternal presence. The Allied teams who measured and documented these specifications understood that they were cataloguing not just a military installation, but a physical manifestation of Nazi ambition rendered in concrete and iron. The damage survey revealed a more nuanced picture than the fortress's survival might initially suggest. While the massive concrete roofs had in fact withstood the bombing campaign, the compartments beneath them told a different story of months of relentless punishment. Several of the submarine berths showed scorching marks from near misses and nearby explosions that had damaged internal structures despite the concrete overhead protection. The damage control systems, which the Germans had continuously upgraded throughout 1943 and 1944, bore the evidence of countless fires fought and small breaches patched. The internal walls in several sections had cracked under the stress of accumulated blast waves, creating structural weaknesses that had required constant monitoring and shoring up. The electrical systems that powered the facility showed signs of emergency repairs, implemented hastily during the final months of bombardment. The water circulation systems, critical for cooling and fire suppression, had been damaged repeatedly and rebuilt repeatedly in what amounted to an endless cycle of destruction and restoration. The Germans had managed to keep the pens functional through engineering determination and desperate improvisation, but each survey marked in the Allied engineers' reports revealed an installation that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. What the engineers found most striking, however, was evidence of the pen's actual operational decline. The submarine berths, designed to hold dozens of U-boats, stood largely empty when the fortress fell. Not every pen was vacant. Some held disabled boats that had been undergoing repair when the German garrison was cornered and then forced to surrender. But the scale of emptiness was remarkable. Briefing documents that